Hi, and welcome back to the History Machine podcast. This is bonus episode number 7 on elephants. I'm your host Niall, and my co-host is...
Cathal, hello. Where's my elephant?
No, don't worry, Cathal. There's going to be plenty of elephants in this episode. So what is this episode all about? Well, if you've listened to any of our earlier bonus episodes, you know that we've done an episode on infantry, an episode on cavalry, and an episode on chariotry. And you don't necessarily have to listen to those, but this is going to be specifically the episode on elephants, which is its own little branch of military in the ancient world. So the goal of this episode is to really address the usage of elephants in warfare in the ancient world, and also then to give an example of their usage in battles. To begin, we might as well address the biology of elephants and explain a little bit about them and go from there. To start, elephants have strong ivory tusks, thin ears, and thick grey skin. Elephants have a special appendage known as a trunk, which is a well-muscled, long, manoeuvrable extension of the nose and the lip. African elephants have 2 fingers at the end of this trunk, and Asian elephants have 1. The trunk is the natural appendage that elephants used in their day-to-day activities. They use it to eat, they use it to drink, they use it to hold, they use it to touch, they use it to throw, to investigate, and even to communicate. It's an extremely functional part of an elephant's anatomy. Elephants have surprisingly thick skin, with the median skin thickness of an elephant at 1 inch. And for comparison, a person has a median skin thickness of only 0.03 inches. So it's a colossal difference. And that helps explain how and why elephants were very hard to kill in ancient combat, which then helps explain their usage in warfare in the first place. War elephants are always bulls, so that's the male, and the cows are female, so they're borrowing the terminology from bovines and from cattle. Now, the reason that a war elephant has to be a male is it's because the cows are afraid of bull elephants, and as such, in the event of rival elephantry, bulls have to be used. There are 2 major species of elephant, and then there are several subspecies that derive from that, and dozens of extinct subspecies. Around 2500 BC, the Asian elephant was domesticated. Now, I'm using that word to an extent because technically, by the definition of domestication, they're not a domesticated animal.
Yeah, I think, giving all those traits of elephants and, big, thick skins, powerful tusks and everything, the main limitation is they're never truly domesticated. And also hard to, breed in huge numbers because they are massive.
Exactly. So with all the complications of breeding the animal, we can't truly say that they're domesticated in the same way that a cat or a dog or a horse is domesticated. It would be more accurate to say they have been tamed. But anyway, regardless, the taming of the elephant was first done by the Indus Valley civilization. From around 1000 BC, the North African bush elephant was also, in air quotes, domesticated. So for all elephant species, the bull is larger than the cow. And for all dimensions that we will use to refer to elephants, we will be talking about bull elephants. So we're just going to go through a couple of the species and explain, their height, their weight, that kind of a thing. Give a bit of a few dimensions to put some numbers on these animals and help kind of understand their size and weight. So the Asian elephant is typically 3.2 to 3.5 meters. That's about 10 feet 6 inches to 11 feet 6 inches in height. And they weigh from a range of about 4,000 to 5,500 kilograms, which is about 8,000 to 12,000 pounds in weight. So, who'd have thought an elephant would be very heavy? So there are several extinct subspecies. Now that means that they're living of the Asian elephant. So there's the Indian elephant, the Sri Lankan elephant, the Sumatran elephant, and then there's the Borneo elephant, which is this feels like an oxymoron saying a small elephant, but their height of the Borneo elephant is only 1.5 meters, which is 5 feet tall, and they only weigh 3,000 kilograms, which is about 6,600 pounds. Smaller in the range as elephants go. So the next subspecies of Asian elephant we're going to move on to is the Syrian war elephant, which is an extinct subspecies. What we know of the Syrian war elephant comes from skeletal remains, so we can't accurately gauge the weight, but based upon those remains, they are comparable in size to the largest observed Indian elephants. So the dimensions roughly for a Syrian war elephant is about 3.5 meters or 11 feet 6 inches in height. The weight is unknown because we're only working from bones here, but they don't seem to differ much in appearance from the Indian subspecies. The other species of elephant that exists is the African elephant. Now, the African elephant is the one you normally think of. You go to a zoo, you see this colossal elephant, very large ears, long ivory tusks. For the African elephant, what we're concerned with for warfare is the extinct war elephant that is the North African bush elephant. Now, the North African bush elephant is smaller than the Asian cousins. Its height is 2.5 meters, or that's 8 foot 2 inches. The weight, because we're working from remains again, is unknown, but it's important to know that it is smaller than the Asian elephants. The North African bush elephant was wiped out from a combination of overhunting, usage in warfare, and then usage in gladiatorial games.
I don't know if there's ever a good reason for an animal to go extinct, but that's a really dumb reason. That was very preventable. That's just sad.
Yeah, it was just really, really preventable. Actually, sorry, just as a side note, it turns out that wherever human beings go, or wherever they arrive in an environment, the megafauna of that environment, and megafauna is like the very large animals, they get decimated, or even beyond decimated, they usually get wiped out. And that seems to be a combination of, it's an anthropological thing, that humans usually overhunt or outcompete those animals. And somewhere along the line they go, hey, wait a second, there's no more mammoths left, what happened? And that is a very common thing. So it shouldn't really be a surprise to find out that, some Romans or you shouldn't really be surprised to find out that Mediterranean peoples end up just wiping out a whole species of elephant.
I'm not surprised, I'm just disappointed.
So you might be asking the question, why even bother use this elephant if it's smaller than the Asian ones? And it's purely a logistical thing. The North African bush elephant was used by the Carthaginians and by the Ptolemies. It's because they didn't have access to Asian elephants. That was the option. The next elephant we're going to move on to is the African bush elephant. Now, this would be the sub-Saharan African bush elephant. The males are 3.3 meters, or 10 feet 10 inches in height. Although some bulls have been observed to be as large as 4 meters or 13 feet. Now, they typically weigh 7,000 kilograms. That's 15,400 pounds. Now, you might be wondering, why were they never used for warfare? And there's two main reasons. The first is geography. The people who were using elephants for warfare did not have access to these animals. And the second reason, which, is much more solid, is it turns out you can't tame or domesticate the African bush elephant. So it can't be done. It's funny that you can have animals that closely related, and it just turns out that this one cannot be tamed.
I almost wonder, though, this thing that kind of came up in the cavalry episode too, is sometimes you don't even want something that big. Once it's big enough, at that point you're just having to spend so much money on feeding the thing and raising the thing, and the amount of time for its lifespan to get to an adult size. It's probably just logistically not going to be beneficial at a certain point when they're that huge.
Yeah, Cathal, because usually the situation is the elephant it doesn't make sense financially, it doesn't make sense economically, but it's often the top tier thing. It's if you got, what's the most expensive military thing in the ancient world we can kit out? And the answer is probably an elephant. It doesn't make sense economically for these things, but it's often they're the ancient world equivalent of the battleship, this highly expensive but considered top shelf piece of equipment. The last elephant, just to mention, that is still in existence is the African forest elephant. They have much smaller dimensions in comparison to the bush elephant. They're only 3 meters or 9 feet 10 inches in height, and they weigh substantially less at 5,500 kilograms, which is about 12,000 pounds. All of that kind of helps explain some of the biology, the physiology, and give some kind of figures onto the size of an elephant in general, just to kind of put it into scope and scale so you can understand, these animals are huge. It's a very expensive venture to get an elephant. It's a very expensive venture. And it's usually done just to have the best thing. Yeah, the elephant usually doesn't make sense logistically or financially. It's kind of you could just use this money to have more troops or more cavalry or do something different. But, we're going to explain kind of how or why they're incorporated in the first place, even though they're so expensive and are often a logistical nightmare. But anyway, on a last note on the sub-Saharan African elephant, it can't be used for warfare. That's why no one has thought to do it.
Yeah. Try it and you'll find out why.
To continue on, elephants are herd animals. They have very large brains, so therefore they are sociable and they are intelligent and coordinated. An elephant cannot trot, they can't gallop, they can't jump, but what they can do is walk very quickly. Now, when I say quickly, it's a little bit ridiculous, the figures we're going to put forward here, but it's 10 miles per hour or 16 kilometers per hour. It's not impressive by any real standard, but what is impressive is they can move at this speed through very tough terrain. Now, that would include descending slopes or sliding down steep inclines or just breaking through obstacles. An elephant can also swim. They can use their trunk as a snorkel. So they're a little bit of an all-terrain vehicle, albeit moving at that slow, lumbering speed. But it's like the ancient world equivalent of a tank. It's just going to go forward, and the obstacles in front of it are not going to stop it or hinder them at all. Elephants are prone to panic in unexpected or dangerous situations. That's usually a very big problem with elephants, because if they panic, they could just turn around. You'll see this in upcoming examples we'll give, but that can cause a lot of problems along the way. Now, even though elephants are from warm climates, they are surprisingly tolerant of cold weather. Now, that's just an aspect of their biology, but it's very beneficial if they need to go through harsh environments, which makes them even more useful in that regard. Elephants consume vast quantities of food, between 150 and 170 kilograms. That's 330 to 380 pounds.
A little bit more than me.
But it's an absolutely astronomical sum of food you have to provide for one elephant per day. Elephants have a notoriously long gestation period, 18 to 22 months. So for comparison, a horse would have a maximum gestation period of 12 months. So you're looking at a good year and a half, 2 years to get an elephant to give birth, which is a really long time if you want to try and repopulate your elephant stock. Given the expense of supporting a large herd of elephants, many of which would be juveniles and unable to be used in warfare or logistics, elephants were historically not bred in captivity. And that is why, by definition, they are not truly domesticated animals. So every time an elephant is used for warfare, it has to be brought in and tamed. So that's a huge investment. So in the ancient world, elephants were trapped, they were tamed, and then they were trained. Now this would be a very cruel, week-long process of breaking an elephant, followed by several months of training to the animal to bear a rider and follow commands. So it might take 2 to 3 years to train a single elephant.
You're just kind of capturing and re-taming and training each time around, basically. Yeah.
And, and in doing so, it was a very, very cruel process. And all the steps along the way are very cruel. Like the training of an elephant is a heavy commitment, so you better want the animal. Another aspect, and this is kind of unique to elephants, an elephant will always use the same rider, and it is the rider who is involved in the breaking and the training of that elephant. The name given to that rider is a mahout.
So if you want warrior elephants, you not only have to have a huge amount of commitment to the time and money required, but also you have to be willing to take on this employee for a really long time.
It's actually really similar to kind of fantasy, novels and TV shows and bits and pieces. There's often this concept that like a dragon can only have a single rider, and the elephant behaves in the same kind of way. It's only got one person to control it, and that person is just, so essential to the functionality of the war elephant. And the reason for that is it's because the rider, the mahout, they have a special relationship with the animal, and they've forged a relationship, albeit like it's created usually upon cruelty, and often there's a couple of carrots thrown in with the sticks as well. But that complex relationship with the animal and the rider is essential for this thing to be able to function as a weapon of war. So if you want to have an elephant, you gotta employ this rider. The earliest warfare elephantry is confined to India, and that's where it originated. But it will spread through the classical world through first contact with the Persians and then the Macedonians and later successor kingdoms. Eventually it'll make contact with the likes of, your Romans and other Mediterranean peoples. The elephant would be used up to and including the 20th century as a logistical beast of burden for warfare. The examples are in some of the Pacific campaigns where you'll have elephants carrying artillery through the jungle. And you just imagine this all-terrain vehicle, it has the ability to do that. That can move at your 10 miles per hour through this horrible environment if need be, in a way that you're going to say your car is not going to be able to do that. The mahout, the rider, would sit on an elephant's neck and control the animal by voice commands, the usage of a special rod or a hook, or by commands with the feet behind the elephant's ears. Mahouts are usually portrayed as unarmoured, which is almost certainly not the case. Now, considering the essential nature of the mahout and the elephant, these people would have had to have been protected with armour and helmets in battle. Mahouts would sometimes carry weapons for self-defence, but the primary weapon was the elephant itself. Mahouts originated in India, and as such they were often called Indoi or Indians, even though most of them would not have actually have come from the Indian subcontinent. Now the skills though that they all have did originate from there, and Indians would have taught Westerners first how to use the animals. It is also possible that some mahouts are descended directly from Indian migrants, which of course would make obvious sense. Due to their size and expense, elephants are often outfitted with elaborate trappings of clothing and or armour. Now this added to the shock and awe factor in battle. Their tusks, for example, could be equipped with like iron swords to help, do their main job, which is killing people in battle. The earliest usage of war elephants would have the mahout fight alone, but by 300 BC, Asian war elephants would be equipped with towers on the animal's back, and they would attach to the elephant by a chain around the belly. Now these towers would be laden with shields for extra protection, would have 2 to 4 men in the tower. Now they'd be armed with bows, javelins and long spears because they need the range. You couldn't possibly hit something with a sword if you're sitting up on top of an elephant. Now the Carthaginians, funnily enough, they did not adopt this practice of towers on the back, and this is likely due to the smaller stature of the North African bush elephant.
I think I was just going to say as well before you move on, there's a real, I think just commenting on the North African elephants not having the towers or anything, this is reminiscent of the previous episode on cavalry and chartry, because you really have to remember this far back in the past, these are not the modern versions of the animals. In the same way, in the previous ones, you didn't have big war horses until, in relative terms, only a few centuries ago. So you had to use chariots or something because they weren't big enough. It's kind of funny here where, African elephants now are all bigger than Indian elephants, but not the ones they were using for warfare in this era. They were smaller than the Indian ones.
Yeah, you wouldn't think, it sounds so silly to say this, it's a smaller elephant than you would expect. But yeah, we, in our heads, I suppose, we don't picture this slightly smaller species of elephant that isn't quite to the same scale as the Asian equivalent.
Yeah, they're still pretty huge, but just not that big.
Yeah, it's pretty big. Not as big as I wanted it. I was like... Anyway, let's move on. So we're going to move on to elephant battle tactics. Now, as mad as that sounds like that'll be a fantastic class. It's all right, today we're going to learn about elephant battle tactics. And you're like, ooh, this sounds very interesting. It's unfortunately not as exciting as you think it should be. So the tactics are very straightforward. You either place the elephants in the reserve or you put them in the main line. Now the usual tactic is to deploy your elephants in a separate line ahead of the battle line, so that they can charge forward, wreak havoc on the enemy front lines, disrupting formations, trampling enemies and leaving them vulnerable to a follow-up attack by your other troops. And elephants are often accompanied by light troops to give each elephant protection to the animal from missile fire and take advantage of any opportunities that elephantry might make on the enemy lines. But all in all, generally, those are the straightforward tactics of how to use an elephant in battle, or how to, what's the orthodox way to use an elephant in your army. Now, you can always be extra creative and do something different with the elephants, but generally, those are the sound tactics. You either place them in reserve, so you can use them in the battle, or you put them in the main line. That's it.
I suppose, as we said, they're only semi-domesticated and semi-tame and everything. You can't try and think too complicated with them. You just kind of get them there and then trust that they're going to stampede in the right direction, if you're lucky.
Yeah, exactly. If you're lucky, and you kind of hope that they stampede in the right direction. The hope is, fingers crossed, they don't just stampede your own troops, which is a very real hazard. When it comes to horses engaging elephants, they are not used to the sight or smell of elephants, so they're reluctant to charge or even approach them. And then likewise, any inexperienced person who finds themselves fighting an elephant, it's an equally terrifying experience. When you think about it, that's very obvious. Like, if you'd never seen an elephant before,
Yeah.
and you come across this giant, lumbering, grey beast with huge tusks, a colossal trunk,
It's definitely got an intimidation factor that you don't have from other things.
you know, you're fighting a nightmare. It's a crazy experience. Like, that has to be a crazy experience. You're pretty much fighting something from your nightmares. The trunk alone is incredibly alien. So in a battle, an elephant likes to use their trunk because that is kind of their natural go-to appendage for any kind of combat moves. So it's common in battle for an elephant to hurl an attacker in the air with their trunk, or swing them around, or smash that person into the elephant's forehead, crushing the attacker. Another horrifying tactic that an elephant likes to do is roll up a person with their trunk and then gore them with the tusks. Like, you might think, geez, these animals are sadistic. But elephants also like to kneel and put their full weight on a fallen opponent. Or in the case of some elephants, they like to crush them instead with the soles of their feet, piece by piece. It's a very bad way to go. You can understand how there can be a terrifying aspect to try to fight one of these, especially if you see people around you being crushed by them. Like, how are you meant to fight this thing? But the main way that an elephant does like to combat a person is just, you know, attack them with the trunk, swing them around, smash them, crush them, and in all these kind of horrifying, gruesome ways to kill a person. And that is how an elephant fights. Now, when it comes to elephants fighting other elephants, though, what they do is they wrap and weave their trunks around each other, they lock tusks, and then they headbutt or shove with the forehead until eventually one of the elephants kind of gives a bit of a side, pushes back on the ground, and then the victorious elephant shoves the loser's trunk aside and gores them with the tusks. Now, in the case of elephants where a tower is present, the attackers would likewise try to spear each other on top of the elephant and fire projectiles at one another, and they would often prioritize trying to kill the rival mahout, because if the mahout dies, the elephant will not be able to be used. And lastly, when it comes to the usage of elephants and their tactics and their usage of them in warfare, they can be used as siege engines. Now you kind of go, all right, they're not exactly like a catapult taking down a wall, but for an elephant, something like a wooden palisade is not an obstacle. It will just smash through something like that, no problem. It just, honestly, something like that is not going to be any kind of a barrier for a large bull elephant to just smash through. So really, that's one of the advantages of what an elephant would bring if you were trying to siege any kind of fortified position. So we've talked quite a bit about the advantages of an elephant and, you know, their terrifying presence and the way they can be used. And so you might be thinking, what are the drawbacks of elephants? Like, what's, you know, we've got a nice little list here of all the pros. What are the cons? So keeping in mind, when we need to talk about the drawbacks of elephants, besides the obvious answer of just constant expense and upkeep, the very process of capturing and then the cruel training required to raise a war elephant will leave the animal themselves scarred, and that will reduce the animal's life expectancy in captivity. Now, this is an absolute certainty because modern elephants in captivity have a reduced lifespan when compared to elephants in the wild. And this is due to the general stress that they would experience in captivity. So you can imagine that the stress for an elephant in a zoo is a lot less for the stress of an elephant used for warfare. Therefore, war elephants are a wasting military asset and they need constant replacement. So, Cathal, have I ever told you the white elephant story? The one from Pope Leo X?
I've not. I've heard the phrase white elephant as something that's like...
something that's perceived as extremely valuable.
Yeah, but maybe to the point of like it's kind of a folly to go after it kind of thing, maybe.
Yes, that's exactly it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, the phrase a white elephant tends to mean something that is perceived as too valuable or rare to be thrown away, but that its maintenance or upkeep is so expensive that it would ruin you.
Jesus.
But because of that rarity or because of that perceived value, you just can't throw it away. So the story behind the white elephant is it's sometime around the 1500s. Pope Leo X gets a gift from the King of Portugal, and that gift is an albino elephant. Funnily enough, a white elephant isn't actually white, it's pink, and that's just the way it is. But they're portrayed in art as white because it's meant to be an albino elephant. So Pope Leo does get this as a gift, and he's like, wow, this is an incredible gift. Such a rarity. I'm probably the only guy in Italy who has one of these. But Pope Leo then has all of these problems with this elephant because he realizes it costs him an awful lot of money. And on top of that, the elephant itself has all these medical issues, and it's costing him a huge amount of money to feed and water this elephant. And then it also produces a lot of dung. So it's just this awful thing, but he can't get rid of it because it's like, no, it's too valuable an item. But he's still going, oh, this is an amazing gift. I love it so much, and I'm really glad I have it. Thank you, King of Portugal. And eventually, when the elephant does die, he buries its skeleton in the Vatican, and it is still there to this day. And it's a nice story, and that is where the phrase "a white elephant" comes from. So, somebody might go, hey, geez, you got that thing, it's a bit of a white elephant, I wouldn't keep it. That's where the phrase comes from. Imagine the idea, if someone had that much trouble with one elephant, imagine what it's like for some ruler who has to manage, dozens or hundreds of the animals. So another problem with elephants is to note that the cows, that's the females, they will always flee immediately if they have to fight a bull elephant. So war elephants are always male. And that's a problem in itself, because even if you have access to elephants, 50% of them are completely useless to you anyway. Likewise, smaller elephant species will flee from larger species due to the strange sounds, the alien smells, and the size differential between the two species. The example for that was the extinct North African war elephant was known to flee from the Indian elephant. But by far the biggest drawback in combat when using war elephants is their tendency to panic and stampede when they're frightened, maddened, or wounded. And this especially happens if the mahout is killed or wounded in battle. So elephants, when they are panicked, they'll attempt to flee the battlefield, and they'll look around, and whatever is in their way, they are going to trample past it. And that often is usually the friendly line that's behind them, and that would just cause absolute carnage.
It is starting to appear that there are more drawbacks to elephants than there are benefits.
Yeah. And funnily enough, there are actually historical examples of mahouts preventing this from happening, but they go about it in a very extreme manner. There are records of the usage of mallets and chisels, or sometimes knives, by mahouts to execute their own elephants if they went into a panic.
Jesus.
So, yeah, it's incredible. So consider the idea that all of the time and effort that was required to capture a young elephant, raise it, feed it, get it to the adult size, train it along the way, all of the money that has been spent on that and the resources, and at the very last second in a battle, the animal's just executed. Think of all of the resources and assets. At the very last second, you just go, I'm afraid we have to kill this elephant. It's insane.
They're big and they're really smart, but also they're big and they're really smart.
Oh, yeah. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, how are you meant to deal with elephants if you don't have them? So the most common tactic to deal with elephants is as they are stampeding towards you. You create gaps in your formation and you allow the elephants to kind of harmlessly funnel through the army ranks. And then at that point, the animals would be surrounded and killed by light troops. Now, albeit that's a very difficult task, but that is how it is achieved.
Oh, so it's kind of like square formations against cavalry, is it?
Yes, it's very similar idea. You just open up the ranks, let the elephants stampede through, you surround them, and you kill them with some light troops. Now, easier said than done, but that is the standard counter tactic to deal with an elephant. Scipio did it at the Battle of Zama, actually. He did that exact tactic. You just create the gap, let the animals funnel through, and deal with them then. That's how he dealt with Hannibal's elephants. The other different, now it's not nice, but the other tactic that's used to deal with elephants is a lot more cruel. Now keep in mind, when we've mentioned before the elephant's trunk, and the elephant's trunk is mentally and physically an important part of the animal to the elephant. It is the arms, it's the fingers, it's the mouth, it's the nose, it's all wrapped up into one. They use it for absolutely everything. It is so important to the animal. But the tactic then to deal with the elephants is to cut off the trunk, and that will instantly terrorize the animal and cause it to go into a panicked retreat. So it's an incredibly cruel but a very effective way of dealing with them.
I feel like I should reflect a bit that I find that so horrific when we regularly talk about thousands of people being killed on this podcast.
Yeah, that's very true. Because, sometimes we're sitting there and we're going, 100,000 people died. Oh, and what? And now we're going,
Yeah.
oh, no, the poor elephant. I hope he's okay. But
Probably have a bit more weight to all of these things, not just the poor elephant. But it is also horrific.
I suppose that's sometimes how empathy works. It's easier to empathize with one thing than, a colossal number. But anyway, yeah, so if we see him heartless, we don't mean to be. You know what? It's a terrible way to deal with an elephant, but it is a way to deal with an elephant. Well, anyway, we've covered quite a bit there about elephants. We've covered physiology, we've covered part of their dimensions, we've covered how they are raised, how they're used, what species there are. We've touched on things like their tactics, their advantages and their disadvantages. And for an episode like this, the bonus episodes, we tend to try and find historical examples that we can use to highlight the bonus content we're talking about. So in this case, we do want to talk about elephants. And the obvious, and it is very obvious, that is usually rolled out anytime anybody talks about an elephant, is the Battle of Raphia. Now, it is the classic example, and it's a classic for several reasons. However, we're not going to be covering that battle in depth, and we have a couple of reasons for that. The first reason is it's been done to death. Open any book on war elephants, and there's going to be a chapter on this. If you listen to any podcast about the Hellenistic age, they're going to go, oh, look at this, it's a very important battle. Now, it is popular as a battle to cover for a number of reasons. The first is it had a long-lasting political effect, but the main reason that it's covered is it's the only known example of North African elephants fighting Indian elephants. And that bit of trivia often brings us to the forefront because people go, oh, look, isn't it funny that the African elephants of the Ptolemies went and fought the Seleucid Indian elephants and the African elephants ran away? Oh, what a little fun fact. And because of that, it's covered so extensively. But the main reason we won't be covering this battle is because the elephants don't play a deciding role in the battle. If they were removed from the equation, the outcome would have been the same. Because keeping in mind, for the Battle of Raphia, the African elephants flee from the Indian elephants, but the side with the fleeing elephants still win. So it doesn't matter. It wasn't an important part of the battle. It's just a fun little fact that's often thrown in. And then when people talk about elephantry and they talk about war elephants and battles with elephants, they talk about the Battle of Raphia. But it sounds silly to go into a little bit of information of how we won't be covering it. Anyway, Cathal, for a battle we're not going to talk about, we won't leave the listeners hanging too much. We will give you, right now, the History Machine's verdict on this battle, just so we can kind of close the chapter on it. And that'll actually help explain why we're not going to talk about it. So, Cathal, what does the History Machine think about the Battle of Raphia?
Yeah, I think the History Machine does kind of, just on you saying that they weren't really the deciding factor. The History Machine gave Ptolemy's side a 70% chance of winning, and then they did. The casualties suffered and the casualties dealt are extremely close to the expected values. It's almost like one of the most average battles when broken down by the History Machine. And as you say, there is novelty in Indian elephants versus African elephants, but then it's smaller elephants will just flee from the bigger elephants, and that is what happened. and also the armies on both sides were absolutely massive, and then maybe 100 elephants, so they just, as huge as elephants are, they're such a small quantity within the overall context of the battle.
Yeah, and there's also nothing impressive about the usage of elephants in this battle. It's very straightforward. It's one line of elephants smashes into the other line of elephants. One of them gives way. That's it. And even the side that have the elephants give way win anyway, so it didn't matter at all. But anyone who talks about elephants in the ancient world, they have to mention this battle. You know what? So we had to just mention it too. So instead of talking about that, we're going to do something else. Now, for researching this episode, we considered finding a very good Indian battle, the birthplace of elephantry. It'd be a great idea to focus on that, find a nice battle with a lot of elephants, check it out and see, what did this Indian king do against this Indian king? That kind of a thing. We thought that would be really interesting. Now, unfortunately, I found it very hard to find any good sources in English to feed to the History Machine. Now, that's a bit of a fault of my lack of languages, and not necessarily because the information isn't out there somewhere. And also, I haven't incorporated a lot of medieval battles that would use elephants into the database yet either. So the fault is really on me upon this, but we're still definitely going to cover elephant battles, but just not an Indian example, even though that would have been a nice thing to investigate.
That would be a good one to do in future, because I know depressingly little about Indian Middle Ages, and there has got to be a lot going on there.
I would have loved to have found a good source here of an Indian battle that we could have addressed and focused on and talked about. But unfortunately, and this is this kind of a product of English textbooks, it's if you were reading an English book talking about India, you would almost assume that history began with the British colonialization of India. Like, and it's not the case. It's just, but like, that's just that's a product of the history books we read and what we learnt in school and that kind of a thing. It's very unfortunate because, because India is the birthplace of elephantry, and even after that, you're talking about civilizations like the Mughals, but we don't have the kind of information we'd like to normally tell the kind of narrative we'd like to tell on a bonus episode. So don't have an Indian example. And for Indian history and for any of our Indian listeners, it's really unfortunate that a lot of English histories on India pretty much start with the British colonialization. It's way past any of the kind of stuff we'd like to cover.
Feel like our history curriculum, even the earlier bits, it's literally Portuguese colonization of Goa.
Yeah.
Like, it's very Western perspective. It is not great.
It's unfortunate because there's so much there, but I just didn't get any good sources I could read or go from there. But yeah, it's worth something. It's something we should definitely investigate in the future. But for this episode, we're not covering Indian history and we're not covering the Battle of Ralphia. So really the question is, what are we covering? Come on, guys, get to the point. But so where we're going to go from here. So we're jumping into the deep end of the Second War of the Diadochi, or the Diadochi. Now, there's a few ways to pronounce that, but the idea being that these are the successor kings of Alexander the Great, and they will spend the rest of their lives tearing each other apart for control of sections of his empire. Actually, Cathal, I never mentioned this, but this is an important note. But Hellenistic kings love owning elephants. They just think they are the bee's knees. They're like modern day billionaires and islands with super yachts. They don't care how much they cost, they don't care the upkeep, they will just pay it. They love having them. And you can almost define when the Hellenistic era begins as the moment these kings get their hands on Asian elephants from Indian sources. And then later along the line, the Ptolemies are going to use African elephants, and that's purely due to logistical issues of not being able to source Asian elephants. So, as I said, we're jumping into the Second War, so you have to ask the question of where's the First War come from. So we're going to give you a little bit of a background, a little bit of context, so you can follow the story. Now, we're not going to go into the heavy details of the First War of the Diadochi, we're just going to go into the Second. So the year is 323 BC, Alexander the Great is dead, and he's surrounded by members of his officer corps. Now, his death triggers some immediate questions that his senior army staff are not nearly qualified to answer. So the first issue is, who is going to succeed Alexander? Because on his deathbed, Alexander's reply to this question was, to the strongest. Now this is actually something that's well worth mentioning because it gets lost in translation when you see this written in English or whatever other language it might be. If you look at the language Alexander would have been speaking, his last words are, to Kratisto, which is oddly similar to a name, Crateros. So Alexander might have just been saying, give it to Crateros, which is one of Alexander's most loyal generals, now unfortunately, he's not there at the deathbed. So the remaining commanders are kind of sitting around Alexander, like, what are his last words? I think you'll find he said to the strongest, not to Crateros. So it really benefits them.
They're like, oh, he definitely didn't say Crateros.
Yeah.
He must have said something else.
I was saying Boo Earns. But anyway, yeah, you can imagine if that's how this is going to start, you can see where it's going to be going. So, funnily enough, Crateros or Crateros, or however you want to pronounce it, well, actually, no, tell a lie. It's very important how you say it. It's the whole point. He was probably Alexander's most loyal general and actually a very logical successor to Alexander. So, as last words, those would make sense. That's not the way that this is remembered. So the next question upon the death of Alexander is, how are they going to hold together and govern the new empire until an agreed successor takes full control? Now, Alexander did the very unhelpful thing of dying before he could actually consolidate any of the new empire in any meaningful way. And when the Persian Empire was taken over, the Macedonians initially ran it on an autopilot system. So they just replaced the top figureheads and they redirected some of the finances, and they kept it under control with a potential threat of military action. And there are regions of the Persian Empire that weren't all that loyal to the Persians to begin with, because they were often culturally very different, or they were separated by thousands of miles from a centralized zone. Then there were other sections that Alexander had only just added to the new empire, and naturally, most of these regions were not too happy with a regime change in the first place, and they're only too keen to go independent once the news of Alexander's death hits. Alexander didn't do much to help to contain this either, as one of the last acts only months before he died was to purge his court, leaving a lot of the high-ranking positions unfilled. But when Alexander died, kind of like the Qin Chinese, in the same way for the first emperor, the Macedonians tried to keep that information under control, but they failed miserably. Now, the Macedonians quickly fractured into multiple factions and re-emerged as two major groups, one representing the views of the cavalry and the other the infantry. So the cavalry branch of the army tended to be aristocrats and nobility, so they're often kind of representing the views of that section, while the infantry is usually the regular common foot soldier or the mid-level officer. Now the cavalry is led by the head of the companion cavalry, a one Perdiccas. Now Perdiccas wanted to await the delivery of Alexander's yet unborn child and confirm did they have a male heir, and aka was this going to be Alexander IV. The infantry though had other plans, because there existed a single living male relative of Alexander. Now, this relative was his brother, and he is perceived as having some kind of mental disability. And this person is known to us as Philip Aridaeus.
Suddenly, when you need a legitimate heir to be your puppet, the mental disability becomes kind of a benefit.
It does. It does. That is exactly it, Cathal. So they proposed a quick elevation of Philip to king. Now, a compromise was made between the two, where Philip would rule, and depending on the sex of the unborn infant, they could then co-rule through a royal diarchy. Now, a diarchy wouldn't have been unheard of to the Greeks. The Spartans, for example, ran with two kings. This is the compromise we're going to come together for these two squabbling factions. Now, in reality, the infantry really wanted to use Philip as a puppet, and likewise the cavalry are going to be doing this with a baby. So
they are both agreed that we do not want any able-bodied adults. It has to be someone who needs a regency.
It's a total, we're going to be governing, but we have a figurehead here ahead of us. So Alexander's a pretty good conqueror, terrible at the admin. Now, this all ends up with Perdiccas, who in terms of rank, nobility and prestige is one of the leading candidates to take over from Alexander. He reduces the mentally handicapped Philip III to the role of a rubber stamp. While all of this is happening, places are up in rebellion, and the senior officers are consolidating their own power, and the first wars of the Diadochi erupt. Now, we're not going to delve directly into these opening sequences, as this is not what this bonus episode is about, but it is important to give some background information on how we got here for what we want to cover. Now, it's also important to know that the chaotic opening moves of the First War results in a positional game that the survivors are about to play. This will result in factors such as who has what territory, what parts of the original Alexander army are aligned with whom, and how the factions have replenished their military numbers, and namely for our episode, with elephants. You see, the reason we're telling you all this in the first place is just we want to set up the situation for what has happened after Alexander's death and the scramble for power that has overtaken his officer corps. And the most important thing to understand about this is this scramble for troops and for resources and for territories will result in the Hellenistic kingdoms getting their hands on elephants. And it's going to result in this wild opening for a positional game that the successors are going to have to play in. So the scramble for power resulted in a few drastic changes to the new successor kingdom's armies. The overall tactics are going to remain unchanged. The experienced commanders don't need any new ideas on how to win a battle. So initially, there was a jostling for who got to control the elite cavalry, and that was usually accompanied by some officers backing. But a bigger fight was for the much more courtable, all-important, experienced Macedonian infantry. So the successor kings would bleed Macedon dry of young men to fill the ranks. When that was depleted, they would resort to filling their numbers with Greeks, and then when they ran out of Greeks, they'd run to mercenaries. Then when they ran out of mercenaries, they would turn to existing infantry across Asia, and then finally they would decide to train some non-Greeks in the phalanx style of war. You can imagine these early Hellenistic armies as some kind of Frankenstein of what was left over from the Alexandrian army, because certain officers are like, well, I've got the good cavalry, and then other ones are, well, I've got the best infantry, and then another officer is like, well, I was able to court the great light infantry. And whatever you weren't able to pull out of the original army, there was a bit of a rush to try and fill that gap with something suitable. So it's almost like, and Carl, we've come across this, when we're talking about the Philip II and the Alexander army, the history machine itself loved that combination. Kind of said, this is a great recipe, it works really well, and it's very hard to beat. And we found that that was a problem in itself for the history machine, where it decided to start giving Alexander great and easy odds to win battles. And so once his officers are pulling from that formula, and it's like, as I said, it's like a recipe, and suddenly you have a recipe where you say, well, I need lemons, and I can't get lemons, so I'm going to use limes, and I need rice, but I can't get rice, so I'm going to get wheat. So they're substituting ingredients in and out to try and get it. So you're going to find these kind of hodgepodge armies of, I've got great cavalry, but my infantry's kind of subpar, or I've got the best infantry, but I'm pretty low on horses. But for all of them, they all kind of turn and have this idea of, what can I use to plug the deficiencies? And the obvious answer for them was elephants. So the biggest change then that would happen to this Macedonian style of warfare was elephants. Because of this heavy demand for original Alexander Macedonian troops, you're going to see people courting these different branches of the army. Now, the original Alexandrian infantry, they were once the salt of the earth kind of people, and they very quickly become tainted by the laws of supply and demand. And their loyalty would be to whoever financially values loyalty the most. So the biggest change to these new Macedonian armies and to Macedonian warfare as a whole was, if you guessed it, the elephant. The Macedonians had witnessed the potential destructive power of Indian elephants during Alexander's lifetime, and they rapidly acquired as many as possible. Spared no expense. For battles, the successor kingdom's infantry and cavalry tactics would stay stagnant, although the elite cavalry might suddenly decide to deploy on the left as opposed to the right, depending on what the other side might do. But the observed tactical changes for battles at this time are almost entirely elephant-based. Indian armies and later successor armies would commonly use the tried and experienced tactic of stampeding their elephants forward and following up with the rest of the army. But what we're about to see is a group of people being both more cautious and more experimental with elephants. And that all leads us to the introduction in our story of a one Antigonus I Monophthalmus, who I'm going to nickname Anthony O'Sullivan.
For listeners outside of Ireland, O'Sullivan's etymology is descendant of the one-eyed, Sulawan, one eye. So, yeah.
So yes, if you want it to be less intimidating, he's Anthony O'Sullivan because monophthalmus means one-eyed. So I'm just borrowing a term here. That's all.
I feel like I'll discover my uncle's friend is named that or something. I don't know. It's that kind of guy. It is funny sometimes when you learn like the meaning of certain names and you realize the equivalent. I think I saw a tweet before where it was someone like going through their phone contacts and being like, it's like I have like John Plummer, I have like, you know, Andy today. There's like you know, Paul with the big ears, and it's just like, oh, this is how surnames were invented. It's person's physical attributes or their job or their relationship to me. It's like this is how they all originated, and I'm reinventing it on my phone.
Yeah, people get names after their profession or a physical feature, whatever it might be. So that's our one eye. Same like names of archers and smiths, you know. So we're introducing ourselves, I'm going to say we're reintroducing ourselves actually to Antigonus I because he was mentioned briefly on our episode on Alexander the Great. I remember at the time we didn't rank him too highly. Now, we have a bit to say about that, but that was according to version 1.0 of the History Machine. And since then, those numbers have been changed as the History Machine was updated, so he's going to feature somewhere different on this episode. More on that at the end. So for Antigonus, to begin, he is the old guard of the old guard. He goes back a long time. Antigonus had originally served with Philip II, Alexander's father, before giving his full support to the young Alexander. And he had been with Alexander for the entire Persian campaign. In the Issus campaign, he had operated independently and competently in defeating a Persian counterattack to sever Alexander's supply lines. But Antigonus, at this point, what separates him from the rest of them is he's a lot older. He is in his mid-70s, but his vigour and ambition are on par with any of the other successor kings. For his history, Antigonus, he survived the purges after Philip's death, he survived the purges of Alexander's lifetime, and then he went on to survive the first wars of the Diadochi. He's able to navigate the often murderous and chaotic Macedonian politics. We are focusing on Antigonus, but another important thing is that he had a son named Demetrius, and the two were on excellent terms. Now, let me just say a kind of a side note about this. This seems insane, what I'm about to say next, but it was very common in Macedonian life that the aristocratic fathers and sons would despise each other. Now, this is part of the cutthroat political backstabbing and the culture, and it's inherited from being a small kingdom. It's part of the cutthroat political backstabbing culture that was inherited from a small kingdom. But it's mad to imagine such hostility between fathers and sons. But in the case of the Macedonians, that was it. Fathers and sons tend not to like each other because, statistically speaking, one of the most dangerous individuals for a Macedonian is their father or their sons. It reminds us of the story where Alexander himself had fled Macedon after his father drunkenly stumbled across the room trying to attack him. It is a world of extreme violence. The odds of homicide are very high. And it was noted that this was really unusual, that Antigonus and Demetrius just got on. So there is a story recorded where Antigonus is conversing with some diplomats at his house. And then his son Demetrius returns home from a hunt, and he's carrying some bloody javelins in his hands. He walks over, armed to the teeth, kisses his father on the cheek, and then he moves on. And this is unheard of in Macedon. This would not be considered normal at all. An aristocratic son would never be allowed be so casually armed and approach his father, especially a father unprotected by his own arms or bodyguards. So it's really unusual, and it is so unusual that Antigonus requests that the diplomats record what they've seen so they can share it with other people, because no one will believe what has just happened. Yeah, as we said, it's a cutthroat society. It's hard to believe that that's not the norm. And what that brings to Antigonus is he has a really loyal and trustworthy ally in his son. And a lot of the other Macedonian officers cannot say that about their own families, and they cannot say that about the other officers. So that gives Antigonus this real leg up in support. And the idea that Antigonus and Demetrius could simply trust each other was both unheard of and also a major boon for both of them. And ultimately, they were both to each other a valuable asset. So onward to Demetrius, who we've just mentioned. So he is the son of Antigonus, and he is the other major player in this episode. To sum up Demetrius quickly, he's got a lot of vices. So he loves food, he loves alcohol, and he loves women even more. So he's a general fan of debauchery in all of its forms. If there's a vice, he loves it. But an important thing about him is he would always sober up whenever he needed to. He would never be drunk on campaign. So whenever there was an important task at hand, he'd give it his all. But it was only during his downtime that he would let himself run wild.
Functional alcoholic, sort of.
Yeah, definitely. If there even is such a thing. But yeah, so that's his thing. Actually, Cathal, I have a couple of examples on Demetrius's behaviour in general, just to kind of give an air of what he's like. So there is a story recorded by Plutarch of Demetrius where he spends several days of drinking and with women and on an absolute drinking bender. And when it is finished, he comes back and excuses himself for his absence, saying that he had a very violent fit of vomiting from food poisoning. And his father replies, "So I heard. Was it the Thasian wine or the Chian wine that gave you the poisoning?" So
It's a very dad response there.
But,
these do have a much more normal father-son relationship where the dad is like, yeah, sure you do. Yeah, we all know, sure.
Yeah, it's a very dad response. It's a nice little summary to realise, to have the idea to realise just how human these people can be, So the other story is there was an occasion where Demetrius was absent for several days. Now, what he was up to was he was partaking in his usual debauched ways, he was consuming lots of alcohol, and he was meeting with lots of ladies. So he had sent a message to Antigonus to excuse his absence, and he claimed he was very sick. So when that story kind of travelled and had reached Antigonus, the level of Demetrius's illness had kind of kept scaling more and more. So by the time the message does reach Antigonus, Antigonus is hearing his son might be on his deathbed. So he's like, oh God, what have I got to do? I better go and visit him. So Antigonus, now hearing that his son had become so ill, hurries to visit him. But when he arrives at Demetrius's house, Antigonus meets this young beauty leaving Demetrius's bedroom. And he goes, oh, okay. Comes into the bedroom, sees his son on the bed, seemingly fine. Goes over, feels his forehead. Don't really have a temperature. So Demetrius says to his father, I had a fever, but it has just left me. And Antigonus replies to him, oh yes, I just met her going out the door. So
yeah, I feel like it's not to say that this is like, these people don't have their personal lives together, have their shit together, and it's not necessarily a healthy relationship, but it's unhealthy in a much more normal way than like the other father-sons of this era who are all plotting to kill one another. This is just the usual kind of, let's make jokes at one another's expense so we don't have to confront the fact that you have various problems.
It's a wonderful story, and I love that a story like that is recorded. It's just it just sums the guy up perfectly.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
I think what's amazing about this is like people don't change. This guy's got a problem with alcohol. He's got a problem with women. He can't keep his hands. You go. It's a really human thing. It's normal. It's something we can kind of Sometimes they're like toxic behaviors or awful relationships, but like we can understand that, and it's a really nice that it's not just these two-dimensional people. You can see that there's a passion and a personality behind them. It's wonderful. Or even the idea where there's a father who's kind of like just letting the behavior slide because he's got a great relationship with his son. He's like, oh, not my little boy. He'll be okay.
I think that's what's coming across to me anyway.
It's amazing. It's wonderful to see that thousands of years ago, same kind of behaviors, people don't change. It's great. We'll move on with Demetrius just to talk a bit more about him. That was more than a little bit of a side note or anecdote, but it's great. So Demetrius would be the one who would elevate his father to the title of Basilius, that's king, and throughout his career, Demetrius would develop the reputation for siege warfare, both good and bad, and he would get the nickname the Besieger. So often when they refer to Demetrius, historians, they would refer to him as Demetrius the Besieger. One of his greatest honours was a deification by the Athenians for, and I'm going to say in air quotes, liberating them from the external Macedonian control. But that aid to Athens was much more of a byproduct of his and his father's wars with the other successors than kind of an intentional liberation of Athens. But regardless, the Athenians decided to deify him for that alone. So to give you an idea of, when we say deification as well, you kind of go, really? Did they really think he was a god? And you go, no, it's much more of like giving him the highest title they could possibly give him. Like the way that, monarchs might dole out a knighthood today. Similar kind of thing. That's how much his actions meant to the Athenians. Now, the third person I'm going to mention here is Eumenes. Now, Eumenes is quite different from Antigonus or Demetrius or any of the other officers of the Macedonians because Eumenes is very much an admin person. He was like the secretary, but because of that he's really looked down upon by the other officers. They're kind of like the rugby chums or the guys in the boys club or the frat house, and he's just the guy at the desk. That's the way they view him. So he has that reputation, or he has that level of disdain from the other successor kings because they kind of see him as they really view him as some kind of upstart office clerical worker.
Yeah.
They really look at him and they kind of go, you're not one of the great cavalrymen, you're not one of the great infantrymen, you're just the secretary. And you got to remember your place. It's almost like if there was a football team, he was there for the big championship win, but he was the towel guy. That's the way the other Macedonians viewed him. Very important to mention as well that Eumenes is Greek. So for that reason alone, he's viewed as an outsider. If there's any football fans out there for Premiership, Spanish or Italian football, if you're familiar with the manager Jose Mourinho, he's a very similar character. He started in the clubs as an admin guy and worked his way up to manager and then ended up managing some of the best teams in the world. But he was always viewed by his contemporary managers as like, you never were a great footballer yourself. He ended up becoming a manager, he ended up becoming a very good manager, but he's still constantly chastised from his peers for what his background was, where he came from. Because of that, Eumenes is really viewed by the others as you're somebody who's very uppity, has gotten much further than you ever should have gotten, and it's almost our responsibility to nail you right back down. So we're going to move on to a very important engagement between Antigonus, Demetrius, and Eumenes, and this is the Battle of Faritake. So to give a little bit of extra background, with the recent destruction of Polypercon's fleet, Antigonus was able to direct his full might towards his rival Eumenes, and he moves his army into Asia towards Mesopotamia. Now, through skillful diplomacy, Eumenes is able to persuade the Persian governors of the area to join his cause militarily against Antigonus, and because of that, he doubles his troops overnight. So even though Eumenes had the numerical advantage, he plays it very cautiously. So his strategy is to lure Antigonus further and further into Asia towards ever more harsher environments to put a huge strain on his logistics. It's one of the old tactics. It's the old land war in Asia. One of the great blunders of history. Antigonus learned of Eumenes' sudden surge of troop numbers, and likewise he decides to proceed with caution. So he halts any pursuit of the enemy army, and he only continues once he's managed to bolster his own numbers and his supplies. Only then does Antigonus proceed, but he follows Eumenes further and further into Asia. Eventually, even though the enemy army was near, Antigonus sent out a foraging party only to have that party cut off at a river and attacked by a column of troops that were led by Eumenes himself, and it results in a panicked rout followed by a very quick slaughter. Antigonus decides he's going to stop shadowing Eumenes, and he moves northward to Media, where he rests and recovers from his losses. He then raises even more troops because he's planning to go on the offensive. At this point, both armies want to be the aggressor, and they want to capitalise on the current state. Antigonus heads south, and Eumenes heads north, where they finally meet at this place, Faritake.
Central Iran. Central modern day Iran. In case we just cannot nail that pronunciation for you.
Oh, yeah. So each commander is now deployed in a strong position, and they're utilising the existing terrain as best as possible. They're incorporating the natural features, they're using rivers and ravines, any kind of incline, and such is the state of positional play that if either side uprooted to attack the fortified position of the other, it would be suicidal. So we have this awkward situation where both sides want to go on the offensive, but tactically they can't. So they just sit there, still, for days. Both sides are draining away at their supplies because, armies are big, they consume food, they consume water. Even the animals consume food and water as well. So they're draining away at their supplies until eventually Antigonus decides, I gotta go up and resupply, I have to leave here. Eumenes becomes aware of this situation and aware of this decision from his military intelligence. So he's planted counterintelligence in the form of deserters, convincing Antigonus that Eumenes is planning a nighttime battle. This is the terrifying prospect that Antigonus kind of goes, oh no, if I try and move now and he has the nighttime battle, he's going to come here and he'll catch us off guard and the whole thing will be for naught. So this leaves the position where Antigonus wants to leave for supplies, but he can't. So instead of leaving to replenish, he wastes an extra night staying up, waiting for an attack that never comes. Eumenes uses that night to relocate his own troops, and once he finds out, Antigonus is in a fit of rage, and he just pursues Eumenes with his cavalry. At dawn the next day, Eumenes is alarmed to find what he thinks is the whole Antigonid army just over the hill. And he's like, how did they follow us? So Eumenes deploys his own troops hastily as best as possible, bracing for this attack by Antigonus. So while the deployment is happening, the rest of the Antigonid army arrives, and they set up some strong positions along the high ground with the cavalry. So the situation has drastically changed, and now Antigonus has the better position along higher ground, and it would be incredibly foolish for Eumenes to attack uphill. But Antigonus is in no mood for a defensive bout. He is furious. He's livid. So, to quote Diodorus, quote, when the army arrived, Antigonus drew it up for battle and marched down in awe-inspiring array against the enemy. End quote. Now, you might ask yourself, why doesn't Antigonus wait? It would have been the much better option. He's in a great position. But in reality, these armies are exhausted. Their supplies are exhausted. And a battle is the most logical decision. Antigonus is giving up his really strong position along the hill. So Eumenes now has a fighting chance. But because Antigonus is still fighting a slight downhill battle, he does still also have an advantage. So you might be asking yourself, Cathal, the question, why is Antigonus doing this? You know, he's got the advantageous position, he's up on the hill. In this current situation, he has the high ground, he has the advantage, he has the better terrain, the better position, the better almost everything. Why is he deciding to give it all up?
It is funny that you asked me why would he do this, because I think you've played me enough in Total War to know that I will regularly give up a great position for an okay one because I get impatient. You know this about me.
Thank you very much. So yeah, the situation then is, you know, he's giving up that advantage, and then Eumenes kind of goes, wait a minute now, I might have a fighting chance because he's giving up his position. And of course, Antigonus is giving up a bigger advantage to have a small advantage, but that would make Eumenes actually more eager to engage in a battle that otherwise he might not engage in at all. So both commanders are top tier experienced veterans in handling troops. We don't need to worry about them. That part of the formula is fine. Eumenes is using Eastern cavalry and elephants. He has some 900 companion cavalry which, in the typical Hellenistic king kind of fashion, he's going to lead personally himself into battle. And he's positioned the heavy cavalry on the right wing, and he's put his lighter cavalry on his left. But what Eumenes lacks in his army is the Macedonian infantry. Now, he does have a few thousand who are loyal to him, and they almost certainly took part in parts of the earlier wars in Asia, so these men would form the centre of his army. But for this battle, Eumenes has managed to get his hands on 3,000 of the cream of the crop of Macedon. And these are the famed Silver Shields. So these men, the Silver Shields, they fought in just about every battle of the Alexander conquest. These people are peerless. They are veterans unsurpassed as infantry in their time, and their loyalty will cost a small fortune. So kind of like as a silly joke, these Silver Shields are worth more than their weight in gold. So now it's possibly hard to stress the Silver Shields, their importance, because they are the best of the best. They are undoubtedly the best infantry in the Western world at this time. So they're courted after like mad. And having them in the army is considered the make or break moment. And the fact that Eumenes has gotten his hands on them kind of puts him at a big advantage for the infantry fight. Just to show how awe-inspiring these guys are, future Hellenistic kingdoms are going to try and recreate some of that magic by naming some of their own units, like the bronze shields or the gold shields or our own silver shields. They're borrowing terms just to try and get a little bit of that Alexander magic rub-off. With the rest of his army, Eumenes is going to pepper in some mercenaries along the rest of the line to try and strengthen it up, and he's trained some men to fight in the style of the Macedonian phalanx to make up the remainder of the line. But what interests us for this episode is how he's deployed 114 elephants along the front of his army as a protective screen, and he has in between each elephant some missile troops. For the battle, Antigonus's plan is to form up his troops in an oblique formation, that's like a diagonal line, and he's going to slowly approach the enemy. Now, he's concentrated his best troops and his cavalry on the right wing, and that includes his largest and most aggressive elephants, which he's also brought to the party. So the plan is for Antigonus to personally lead a cavalry charge with his right wing, followed by his strong right, and then roll up the enemy lines. And in a way, that's kind of it. Like that's a typical Macedonian plan. It's one they would have done before. It would have been a tried and tested success. It's a reasonable plan. It's a good plan. It's the kind of plan that Antigonus would have executed here. So Antigonus believes, based on his knowledge of Eumenes and his knowledge of Macedonian tactics, that Eumenes is going to do something, or it will intend to do something very similar, where the right wing will be strong. It'll try and go up, engage the enemy, roll around them, and win the day that way. So to prevent that, Antigonus has instructed the commander of his left flank, a Pythion, to hold back for as long as possible and increase the amount of distance and time required for Eumenes to come into contact and stall the chance of a win there. So now the battle begins. Now to see the awe-inspiring march downhill of the elephants, the cavalry, and the troops just slowly approaching. And it must have been an absolute terror to behold. But the further he gets, he notices that the plan cannot proceed, because guarding against his planned attack is a line of elephants. Antigonus stops. He takes his one good eye and he strains it to see what can he do next. And he takes his time, because he cannot see a good option. And he begins discussing with his officers, what could we do next? When suddenly, Antigonus's whole left wing and centre come barreling down the hill to attack Eumenes' army. What happened was, while Antigonus was stopping to decide what to do next, the left wing that was commanded by Pythian received no news of what was going on, and they concluded Antigonus has got to be in trouble. So they decided, let's seize the initiative and we're going to attack on our own. So
I so get this guy. Again, my total war strategy often involves forgetting what the other half of my army is doing until it's too late. I absolutely... This is me.
So the one thing they didn't want to happen is what has happened. The left wing was never intended, the best case scenario was the left wing was not going to ever engage him in his army, and now it's the first point of contact. So Antigonus is boiling with rage. It's the one part of the army he intended to never come into contact with the enemy, and it's decided to do just that. So if Antigonus is to call back his left side, the reshuffle would be inviting a vicious battle-winning counterattack. So he decides he's got to let the left wing attack, and hopefully something good is going to come of it. So Pythian's main advantage, that is, if he has any advantage over Eumenes, is that his light cavalry outnumbers Eumenes' heavy cavalry. So in that game of hit and run, the light cavalry proceeds to pick them off, and the cavalry engagement is looking somewhat well. Along the line, though, Eumenes' screen of elephants are a mixed blessing. The ones near Pythian's harassing light cavalry have gone into a panicked, bleeding frenzy from missile fire, and they are trampling their surroundings. On the other hand, Eumenes' centre is performing excellently. Antigonus' troops are getting mauled to pieces by the Silver Shields and their friends, who are cutting through whoever they face. Eumenes, though, is in serious trouble himself because he cannot catch Pythian's light cavalry, who keep dancing around him. To solve this problem, Eumenes sends for his own light cavalry from his other wing, and they arrive in the nick of time, and with the help of some heavy units, they engage and defeat Pythian's light cavalry. Meanwhile, the elephants have raged to a point of madness, but luckily for Eumenes, they've decided to barrel into the enemy army and not his own. So Antigonus' centre is collapsing, and his phalanx is beginning to rout, and more than 2/3 of his army is now routing. And at this time, Antigonus has remained stationary, and he's looking at the events unfold. And he's trying to eye a solution to this problem, because what he is witnessing is almost certain defeat. At this point, the rest of his officers are pleading with them, just retreat, save yourself, save what you can of the army for the march home. Antigonus won't leave, because he's absolutely livid. And this is because his loyal Macedonian troops are routing. And these are the loyal infantry who are meant to be loyal to him. And Antigonus is stubbornly trying to do anything but retreat. And then finally, with the one eye, Antigonus sees an opportunity. So what he spots is Eumenes' army had slowly drifted to the right as the battle raged on. Now, this is a feature of Greek and Macedonian armies. It's a tendency of the phalanx to drift slightly to the right. Now, they were drifting slightly to the right, and in their enthusiasm, they're pursuing the routing troops. Eumenes' left wing had also been depleted of cavalry due to that relocation earlier, and the elephants on Eumenes' left wing have not moved at all. So now they're too far, and what are they too far away from? They're too far away from a new, small, exploitable gap that has formed in the lines. Antigonus thunders down the hill with his son Demetrius, and they punch straight through that gap with their companion cavalry, and they circle behind the exposed rear, cutting apart whatever they come into contact with and dissolving Eumenes' left wing. Sections of both of the armies are now routing, and both commanders pull back, regroup, reform, and claim victory. So who won? Jimenez infantry inflicted much more casualties, and right until the last cavalry charge, the battle had seemed decided. Antigonus, though, saved his army by exploiting that lucky chance, but his army definitely ended the day worse for wear. Now, as a little bit of a side note, in Greek and Macedonian culture, the army who holds the battlefield the next day is considered the victor, as the other side has to request to remove their dead. It's kind of a, well, we won, we hold the field, and that's how it works. It's king of the hill, king of the castle, the guys who won get to stay on the field. That's usually the case. Jimenez had hoped to contest the field the next day, but his men refused. Instead, they were deciding to secure their goods and their booty, and that left Antigonus to hold the battlefield, and by that metric, he would be declared the victor. Default. Now, as messy as this is, it is considered a Jimenez victory by casualty numbers, an Antigonid victory by battlefield ritual, and a victory by both commanders by declaration. This is a strategic mess by outcome, and it is considered a draw by the history machine. So, Cathal, let's go into some of the stats. What does the history machine think of this?
Yeah, so we assigned this a draw, but I think the stats do favour Jimenez. Antigonus had a 75% chance to win and only managed to draw out of it.
Okay, wow.
Their casualties dealt were 12% less than expected, and their casualties suffered were 42% more than expected.
Fair.
So in terms of casualties, Jimenez was much more sensible, lost way less of his army, whereas Antigonus took huge casualties in this one for what was achieved.
It kind of makes sense because he was literally waiting around for his troops to die. So
yeah. It's definitely something that the history machine, it'll flatter Jimenez stats a lot more than Antigonus. It does feel like Antigonus should have won this and kind of just really let it get out of hand.
Well, he kind of did let it get out of hand because, you know, it was ultimately his decision to stop the army and then have a lack of communication with his sub-commanders. Then with that, triggering a panic and then triggering an entire engagement that he never intended to happen.
Yeah,
so
it was just messy all over. Yeah.
It is Antigonus's fault in the sense of he came in with a battle plan, then he stopped it, didn't tell anybody what was going on, had to try and plan on the fly, and resulted in this entire horrible engagement just happening.
Just kind of really struggled to innovate. He just kind of froze.
I mean, yeah, the plan was to approach the enemy in an oblique formation slowly. He comes across the first problem, aka a bunch of elephants, and the plan goes out the window.
Yeah. Now, there are some things that the history machine probably missed in terms, it gave him a heavy advantage over, even though they were similar army sizes, it gave him 75% chance. And I think a lot of that is because they had a lot more heavy cavalry, and it didn't factor in that Jimenez had, like, super elite, mega heavy infantry. Well, it was, like, the best of the best heavy infantry, even though there were fewer of them. So it's possible that it should have been closer to a 50-50 estimation for the battle.
Yeah, it's interesting that the history machine thinks, with fairness, he had a good chance, so it's an interesting result. Keep in mind, Cathal, even though Jimenez does have the best of the best super heavy elite infantry, the rest of his line is notably weak that has to be peppered with mercenaries and recently trained individuals.
Yeah.
So he does have this, solid tip of the spear that is the best of the best, but the rest of the spear is fairly brittle and fragile. And the fact that the Silver Shields and the older Macedonian troops and the veteran troops perform really well is more of an indication of just how good they are. And it's a benefit to Jimenez for this battle. The strength is not in his line in this battle. He just happens to have the best of the best within the line and some other good troops along in that line as well.
Yeah, it's a top-heavy army.
Yeah, it is a top-heavy army. But we have to note as well that the Antigonids, they do have kind of on average the better infantry. Their line should be better than Jimenez's line. It's just the fact that Jimenez has the best of the best on his side, but the rest of his line is a lot weaker. And
yeah.
All in all, the Antigonid line should just punch through it, minus the Silver Shields and the veterans.
Definitely both sides made a lot of mistakes along the way.
Okay, there's a lot in there. To delve a little further, we do want to talk about the elephants because, that's the whole point of it. The elephants are a major part of this battle, and they do result in several major outcomes during this battle. The first thing, which is, pardon the pun, the elephant in the room, they stop the Antigonid battle plan in its tracks. The plan was this beautiful oblique formation to come down a hill and engage the enemy and be able to roll up and just take out Jimenez and end this very swiftly. And that is stopped immediately, and it is stopped solely because of the elephants. And because of that, the elephants trigger the impromptu engagement of the troops that were never intended to come into contact. They throw the Antigonid battle plan completely out of the window, and literally the elephants stop it.
Yeah, they're really a wild card.
The elephants nearly trampled their own army during a frenzy, and they just happened to trample the enemy army, which is a benefit to Jimenez, but that's a complete flip of a coin.
It feels like every time they're deployed, it's like a dice roll of, will they attack the enemy, will they attack both sides, or will they turn around and fully just attack you or run away?
Yeah.
It's just not certain until it happens which way it's going to go. I think you're more so relying on the other army being intimidated into routing than you are actually hoping you have to use them.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. And the last part about it is the elephants result in that exposed gap. Their presence nearly costs him the battle, but their presence actually allows him to somewhat salvage the battle at the end. It's purely the presence of the elephants that creates this. So to move on, the aftermath resulted in both armies settling down for the winter and planning the next engagement. Antigonus raised as many troops as possible to replenish the number he had lost in the last battle, because he's still keen to go on the offensive, but he wanted to catch Jimenez by surprise. Antigonus declares publicly he'll go west to invade Armenia, but instead he heads towards Jimenez's winter camp. Antigonus tries desperately to keep his troops' movements a secret, and so he decides to avoid using the regular routes, and instead he transports his troops through a frozen salt desert. Now, to add to this harsh environment, he denies, in winter, the building of any campfires for his troops. So you can imagine the cold, miserable, awful state of affairs that his camp is in, on the move to try and catch Jimenez. Eventually, on the 5th night of cold, a particularly bitter chill takes over, and his frozen army decides just to defy his order and light hundreds of campfires. Antigonus is annoyed, but there is nothing he can do to stop the hundreds of fires from being lit. His troops are just fed up to that point. They do not care. They are too cold. Unluckily for Antigonus, there happens to be friendly people to Jimenez just a few miles away who witnessed the hundreds of fires. They race to the nearby Jimenez encampment and inform him. Now, at this point, Jimenez officers panic and advised a hasty retreat. They didn't realise there's an army springing up against them. But Jimenez calms them, and instead he organises a quick assembly of his scattered troops. To buy time, he has a few cavalry troops ride out and light hundreds of campfires several miles away to draw the Antigonids off course and buy some much needed time. Now, this ruse works. Although the extra time is bought, Antigonus still has the chance to pick off some of the assembling troops. Now, he is fixated on finding and eradicating Jimenez elephants. Antigonus has deduced, once again, it's elephant focused for this, because Antigonus has deduced that these large, expensive beasts are the reason he was denied his last victory, and he's very keen to prevent them from being used again. So he sends a large contingency of cavalry to intercept and confiscate the elephants, and he was almost successful, but he was stopped just in the nick of time by troops from Jimenez. So this was his last chance to remove these elephants off the board and have the kind of battle he would have liked to have had. Antigonus had force-marched his army through cold, dry, barren land, but at last both armies met and assembled in the vast salt flats of Asia, ready for their second battle. And with no natural features to incorporate in the vast open salt flats, they both deploy for battle. This would be the Battle of Gabbiani. The battlefield itself was in a poor state, and that's through a combination of a hot summer and a dry, cold winter, and that has made the vast open area prone to dust clouds from the slightest troop movement. And although the level terrain plays to the phalanx's strength, the dust clouds would prove to be an issue. Antigonus is outnumbered for this battle, so he deploys his heaviest infantry in the centre, with his 65 elephants and light troops forming a screen at the front of the line. Antigonus's left wing of cavalry is once again commanded by Pythian. Now, his right wing is under the command of Demetrius, his son, with the heaviest of cavalry under the command of Antigonus himself. Jimenez has the advantage of accurate intelligence and he was able to deploy his troops whatever way he wanted to react to the Antigonids. So Jimenez places his heavy cavalry to the left wing. So here we're going to see a little bit of a change to the typical Macedonian deployment. Typically, the Macedonians like to put their infantry in the centre, they like to put their heavy cavalry on the right wing, their lighter cavalry on the left wing, and then they like to put some supporting troops or missile troops beside the cavalry. That's the kind of bread and butter Macedonian layout. At this time, we're going to see slightly different deployments because we're going to have Macedonian-style commanders taking on other Macedonian-style commanders. So for the last battle we saw an oblique formation. For this one, we're going to see a mirror formation. So what's going to happen is Jimenez has the advantage of accurate intelligence. So he knows what the Antigonids are going to do. And because he knows this, he's able to deploy his troops whatever way he wants to react to the Antigonids. So Jimenez places his heavy cavalry not on the right wing, which is normal, but on the left wing, and it is like a mirror to the Antiochus' setup. He has near him most of the Macedonian governors and his own most loyal and efficient troops. Now, this is something I really wanted to note. It's important for this battle. But at this time, the officers in Jimenez's army are not happy to be taking orders from him. There's a combination of reasons, but the main reason is Jimenez is Greek. He's not part of the Macedonian inner circle. He's not one of the old rugby chum boys. He's not one of the old Alexander friends. He is kind of considered the admin guy, and even more so than that, he's considered the southerner Greek who has gotten his way into this position of power. And the Macedonian officers in Jimenez's army believe he's becoming far too influential, and what they would really love to do is just get a good Macedonian officer to assume his place. So the probability of assassination here is not zero. So in order to combat this threat, Jimenez keeps his most loyal troops and bodyguards near him at all times, and he continues this trend on the battlefield. Jimenez is denying his Macedonian officers their normal positions throughout the line. Now, as a result, he has weakened the command structure of his army. So what he's done is he's decided to keep his friends close, but his enemies even closer. And we'll see how that goes. But as a result of this, the most effective of his officers are now grouped around him, and the most ineffective and least trustworthy of cavalry remain on his right wing far away from him, and they're placed under the command of a newbie commander named Philippus, who could be classed in our database as an unknown. And Cathal, we know from experience that the unknowns and the unnamed commanders and the guys who never show up again, they tend to have a terrible reputation.
Yeah, for reference, unknowns on average, their average win over expectation is around minus 10%, and their casualties suffered are 50% higher than known generals, just to give a sense.
There's a reason they're not mentioned more than once. So, not looking good. We can see Jimenez, for this structure, for this layout, he has decided to get the best and brightest, be they friend or foe, and surround them around himself, while kind of hindering the command structure of the rest of his line, and then having his actual right flank of cavalry be really subpar, and that's going to be a problem. So to come back to what's important about this episode, the elephants, Jimenez would use his numerical superiority in elephants to form a tighter and longer screen in front of the army, and he's going to add an extended line on the left wing to prevent outflanking manoeuvres. So with everything deployed, everybody's ready to go, the armies slowly march towards each other. And they kick up enormous amounts of dust and debris, really limiting visibility. Actually, I forgot. There's a lot of side notes in this episode, but a little one before the armies engaged. This is a fun little story. So a lone horseman appears on the battlefield, riding through this dust cloud, and he's just outside of missile range. And the Antigonids see this horseman coming towards them, and they're amazed at the brazen nature of this unknown single cavalryman who turns out to be a messenger. So he proceeds to single out an Antigonid phalanx in front of him, and he points at them and he shouts, quote, "You wicked men are sinning against your fathers, who conquered the world under Philip and Alexander, and in a short time you will see what the silver shields can do." End quote. So So this was a last moment, last second message sent by the head of the Silver Shields to demoralise the enemy that was going to be straight in front of them. And this works. The visibility here is so poor from the dust clouds being kicked up. The armies can't see each other, but they can hear each other. And when that lone horseman delivers this message, Jimenez's troops hear the taunt and they erupt in cheers of approval. And the Antigonid centre, out of terror from a combination of this message and the noise they're hearing, the kind of the rallying cries of the enemy, they stop moving forward. They're paralysed with fear. And with this, Jimenez decides to go on the attack. So Jimenez orders his extended elephant line to attack and wrap around Antigonus's right wing. Seeing the line of elephants and light infantry lumbering towards him, Antigonus knows his cavalry and infantry won't be able to fight them off, so he quickly assembles his largest and strongest of elephants, along with some light troops, to launch a countercharge. Now, Antigonus is hoping that the quality of his elephants will compensate for the quantity that they're facing. So he readies his own cavalry for an attack elsewhere, now that he believes he might have nullified the elephant threat. Jimenez, seeing that his elephants have now stalled, focuses his offensive on the centre, and he applies immense pressure to that centre. Now, if his troops can break through any section along the line, then a quick cavalry charge could ensue and almost certainly guarantee his victory. So the Antigonids are put under immediate pressure. The elephants on the left wing are furiously shoving and they're grappling with each other while they're trampling the various light troops underfoot. It is brutal. So from here, Antigonus has a eureka moment. He decides he's going to use the extremely limited visibility to move his cavalry out and around these warring elephants. So he sends his light cavalry to capture Jimenez's baggage train, and he's going to get his heavy cavalry, spearheaded by himself and his son Demetrius, to attack Jimenez personally. This is the goal. If they kill him, the whole thing might be over. Jimenez, in this cloud of dust, at kind of the last moment, witnesses an overwhelming number of heavy cavalry charging his position, and he's about to learn why you shouldn't keep your enemies closer. The disloyal Macedonian officers in his entourage, they just leave. So they up and they go, and about 1,500 of his own cavalry that are surrounding him leave him to his fate. So Jimenez only has a few hundred cavalry and his bodyguards surrounding him, and miraculously and bloodily, he fights his way out of this. Meanwhile, in the centre of the battlefield, Jimenez's phalangites have utterly crushed and routed the Antigonid centre. The Silver Shields have delivered where they needed to deliver, and the battle should have been won. And if this was another battle, it might have been. But the Antigonid cavalry have gotten around and are dispersed and attacking the rear of Jimenez's phalangites. So in desperation, Jimenez has a solution to try and salvage a win. He will go and find and kill Antigonus. So he proceeds to charge around the battlefield, fighting furiously, hoping to find and kill Antigonus. But he can't find him. And by now the light cavalry of Antigonus have seized the booty of the baggage train of Jimenez, and they're hauling it off. Now, when I say the baggage train, this includes not just, the money and the gold and maybe some of the supplies and the food. It's the families of the enemy army. Jimenez's troops' families are now currently held hostage. Back to the elephants. We'll see what they're up to. So, at this point, the elephants of Jimenez's army have tried to disengage from the opposing elephants and do something about the cavalry around them. But the chaos of that attempt, mixed with the dust clouds and the pressing assault of Antigonus's elephants, Jimenez's beasts panic, and the fleeing light cavalry leave the elephants exposed, where Jimenez's elephants are defeated. At this point, Jimenez has learned that his baggage train has been captured. This is a serious problem. So he locates what cavalry he has left to his still undefeated right wing, and he tries to rally what he can, and he says to his recently, traitorous Macedonian officers something along the lines of, we can still win. We have the infantry and they don't. We need to pull this together. But the officers just abandon him. They take their cavalry off the battlefield with them. They are no longer going to be working with Jimenez. So having learned from the last battle and almost afraid to take any initiative of any kind because of last time's huge blunder, our commander of the Antigonid left wing, Pythian, now slowly marches his light cavalry into battle for the first time and attacks the enemy infantry. So he was kind of so panicked about the idea of, I shouldn't have gone forward in the last battle. I'm not meant to take any kind of initiative. Obviously he was dressed down, and now it's one of these moments of, so now finally when the battle is nearly over, he's like, I think maybe I should probably engage something. So Pythian now slowly marches his light cavalry into battle and he attacks the enemy infantry. The initially incredibly successful infantry at the centre of Eumenes' army, the Silver Shields and Friends, have a very good reason to believe that because they've done their part, they've won the battle, provided that's everybody else, did fair or did their job. But through the clouds of dust and the limited visibility, they don't see any of that. And they find themselves, even though they've won their little battle, constantly being attacked by enemy cavalry. So they kind of realise something's gone wrong. We might have routed the infantry, but the cavalry haven't left, and they're picking us off and attacking us. So they form a dense, impenetrable square, so they don't have to worry about the enemy infantry, so for the remainder of the battle, they're going to be harassed by cavalry. The battle ends at nightfall. Eumenes retreats, but he's eager to try again in the morning because they still have infantry in their army and their enemy doesn't. If they go to day 2, he's got this. That's very important. He has infantry, the Antigonids don't, they only have some cavalry. This can be done. The incredibly successful and practically untouched Silver Shields decide instead, listen, they're going to hand over Eumenes in exchange for their families and for their savings. Now, keeping in mind, I just want to note about this, the Silver Shields themselves, they've been fighting for decades, and they would have brought to this battle and to their encampment just about all their wealth with them. If you can imagine, literally their lifetime savings plus their families have been brought here. There's not exactly a bank they can leave it with, they bring it along.
No banking system yet, I suppose, for the wealth, but...
And all of this has been lost in the baggage raid, so they're more than eager for a swap. The option is my life savings and my family for this Greek commander. I know what I'm going to do. So Eumenes is handed over and he is promptly executed.
I kind of love hearing about this battle because I think I've gotten so used to battles with people like Caesar or Alexander, and they're so valorized and considered so heroic, and the battles are always presented as they were just a genius and they did everything so cleanly. These are people that the historians kind of regard as, like, on both sides, they're a disgrace to Alexander's legacy from all their infighting, and every blunder, every bit of chaos and confusion is highlighted, and the whole thing with Eumenes, it's like, he's not doing the worst tactics, but no one respects him. And they were all just kind of bought, by his wealth into his service. So when it comes into these, like, real tough moments, they are not, like, they have no real loyalty. But it's just like, it's so messy. There's nothing clean in any of this. No one can see anything. Everything's just totally mad. People lose track of their armies. It's a lot less, I think, embellished than a lot of the battle accounts that we have from this period.
I think the Silver Shields are thinking to themselves, why bother take a chance? We don't like you.
Yeah, there's so many times when we've said take a grain of salt with this one. I think the historians were kind of favouring this side. But this time it's like, no, I think this is just a mess. Whoever was writing about this did not like either army.
So all that said, Cathal, we've gone through quite a bit there. After all, that was a fairly intense battle in terms of, a lot of moving parts, a lot of action, a lot of tactical decisions, a lot of changes, a lot of treachery, And in both situations, even though the Silver Shields perform well, they're not the deciding factor. They haven't been that big difference that they were meant to be.
Yeah.
So what does the history machine think of this?
Well, it turns out if those payments just get stolen, their loyalty depletes an awful lot. Yeah, the stats are... This one, if it wasn't for all the treachery, it probably would have been another draw, arguably.
Okay.
And the history machine kind of predicted a draw. It gave Antigonus the slight edge at maybe 55% chance of winning, but yeah, it was very close between the two of them. The casualties suffered and the casualties dealt were very close to the previous battle, where Antigonus took a lot more losses than he should have. Eumenes took a little bit fewer than expected, but yeah, it just, that wasn't enough for him because he lost the money, and that was more important than it didn't matter if he had, like, cleared out the enemy infantry. He lost the money, and all his army's loyalty was based on that money. It's not a factor I think the history machines have ever had to deal with before, the concept of like how secure is the bag.
Yeah. Yeah, we have it all in one place and you lost it. So
Yeah, I'm sick of kind of all these like poetic versions of battles, or making it all sound heroic or valorous or whatever. So it's just refreshing to hear something where it's just like no one could see anything. It was too dusty. Everything was like no one had a clue what was going on. At some point, we lost all the money, and once we realized that had happened, we turned over the general.
Yeah. So yeah, I know. God, it's made for an interesting thing. But this is the bonus episode on elephants. So I suppose the learning of elephants for this battle is that if you have elephant superiority, it does not guarantee that your elephants will triumph against the opposing elephants. Because we've seen in this situation that the quantity of Ximenes elephants are countered by the quality of Antigonids. And it's a case that the larger bulls, or that the better, stronger ones, are able to actually stop an opposing elephant charge in that manner. And in the end, because the light cavalry that accompanies Ximenes elephants leave, and because of that early detachment to try and save the cavalry, you really see that once an elephant line is flipped by the opposing elephant line, it's routed or killed or destroyed, whatever you want to look at it. And that elephant superiority does not guarantee victory in elephantry.
Yeah. It just feels like the elephants are too chaotic and unpredictable to really... For every time they successfully, stampede in the right direction, there's another time where they just either stand still or just kind of run into their own army. It's just... They're too much of a wild card really to count on.
Yeah. So for the first battle, the deployment of the elephants could not be ignored, and it dictated the sequence of events. And in the case of Pythian, he went and attacked prematurely. And obviously for this battle, he has been chastised to not do that, and has even held back and been far too timid to attack. So, that's been another factor that we have to consider. But for this battle, the usage of elephants is quite different. Their deployment now should have a bigger effect, but it doesn't.
Yeah.
We're going to skip forward to the biggest battle between the Antigonids and the successor kings. There is a 14-year gap between the death of Ximenes and the next engagement we want to cover, the final battle, the Battle of Ipsus. So we're not going to delve into the details of what happened in between this time, but it's just important to know that there were many bloody battles, sieges, alliances made and broken, territories lost and gained, and all of that is just the norm. The line of Philip II and Alexander the Great has been thoroughly snuffed out, and what has replaced them now are new dynasties, who carved up what was left of Greece and Asia like a cake. At this time, Antigonus was at the height of his power, and there was one last great attempt to reunite what had been Alexander's empire. Although we should keep in mind, this was not done by some kind of loyalty to Philip or Alexander. This is purely for selfish reasons for the new dynasties. Antigonus' son Demetrius would be responsible now for leading the armies, and although they were successful in many battles, the Antigonids had failed to take control of Egypt, Rhodes, or Babylon against Ptolemy and Seleucus. We haven't mentioned at all in this episode Ptolemy or Seleucus. They were mentioned in the Alexander the Great episode, but safe to say they are also successor kings. So Ptolemy was one of Alexander's great friends. He was educated with them, rumoured to be a half-brother. He was a cavalryman during the Alexandrian campaigns. So Ptolemy would manage, through by hook or crook, carve out Egypt for himself and claim that as his kingdom. The other person we mentioned is Seleucus, and Seleucus is very interesting because Seleucus is not like Ptolemy in the sense of he wasn't one of Alexander's close friends. He was a junior officer during the Alexander campaigns, and after Alexander's death, Seleucus managed to kind of work his way to the top. So once Seleucus found himself in this position of power, his goal was to try and make any alliance with just about anybody to get, formal recognition that he's a king, and in exchange, he'll provide military support. And Seleucus is very willing to lend his support because he wants to stay alive. So Seleucus, almost by a miracle, had managed to hold off various Antigonid assaults. And he would also manage to tackle conflicts at the very edge of the empire at India. Now, unfortunately for us, we don't have the details of Seleucus's campaigns and his battles in India. And the reason for that is it's just disappointing. They weren't deemed important enough to record, so it's kind of considered a sideshow. But what is important about these campaigns and what is recorded is one very important fact. Is Seleucus gave up conquered territory in India, and in exchange, he's getting 500 elephants. So Seleucus makes this exchange with a great Indian king, and Seleucus finds himself as the best source of elephants for the Hellenistic kings.
He has the most elephants.
So yeah, he traded it for 500 elephants. So he would get those 500 elephants from the great Indian king Chandragupta Maurya. Now hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. And sometimes I think he was given a Greek name, Chandrakotas. Okay, the next player we're going to have to mention is Cassander. Now we didn't talk about Cassander really at all, but Cassander was another one of the successor kings. He was heavily involved in the War of the Diadochi, and he will suffer defeats in Greece from Demetrius, and he will beg for mercy from Antigonus, who would refuse to give him a pardon. And this will leave Cassander to take what is left of his army and attempt an alliance with Seleucus and Ptolemy. Now Cassander would call on support from another officer of Alexander, Lysimachus, the self-declared king of Thrace. Lysimachus, we didn't really go into him at all either, but time to just mention him quickly because he's important here. So here's the background to our battle. Lysimachus would invade Anatolia, and that would spur on a counterattack from Antigonus. Seleucus would advance with a huge army that includes 400 elephants from Babylon. Ptolemy, ever the opportunist, he advances his army and starts claiming territories that are easy picking, and he'll retain full control of Egypt without truly committing to the cause to defeat Antigonus. Seeing that Seleucus, Lysimachus and Ptolemy now surround him, Antigonus needs to deal with this drastic situation, and knowing the nature and character of Ptolemy, Antigonus decides to spread some rumours that he has already defeated Seleucus and Lysimachus. And a panicked Ptolemy then decides to retreat to the safety of Egypt, leaving some troops just to garrison the territories that he had boldly claimed. Antigonus then had, with a simple bit of disinformation, removed one powerful enemy from the equation. From here, he looks to bolster his position by recalling Demetrius, who then quickly agrees to a truce with Cassander, and he marches to combine forces with his father. Cassander, who's now free from the pressures of Demetrius, supports Lysimachus as much as possible. In the spring of 301 BC, Lysimachus and Seleucus are able to combine their forces to battle Antigonus and Demetrius. Here we're going to see some of the largest Hellenistic armies, which would be 150,000 plus men, and importantly for us, 500 elephants. They meet for battle to decide the fate of the successor kingdoms of Alexander. This would be the Battle of Ipsus, which also has another name. It's known as the Battle of the Five Kings. For Antigonus, this battle should have been something he was looking forward to. Finally, he's going to get the chance to defeat his rivals in a pitched battle, and in one decisive clash, he could rid himself of his most dangerous rivals and rule the vast majority of the Alexandrian Empire. Now, this is not the case for Antigonus. Several things are taking their toll. Firstly, he's 81 Gaul, which in the ancient world, he might as well be 100.
Yeah.
He's weary, he's aged, he recently had a bad fall, which was interpreted as a bad omen, and that also resulted in the injury of his leg. So because of his injuries and his old age, he could no longer ride at the head of his army, and he'd have to govern away from the centre. Lastly, if this battle had taken place 15 years ago, he'd be in a much better physical state to partake, and his enemies would also not have been as numerous or as great as a threat. Antigonus's rivals became what they were due to failed military and political actions over the last 14 years. So for the armies, Antigonus would outnumber the enemy in infantry, but he would be the underdog in both cavalry and, thanks to the help of Seleucus, be vastly outnumbered in elephants. So the army of Seleucus, Lysimachus and Cassander would have had superiority in missile cavalry. Now this is namely due to their access to nomadic horse archers, and they have a nearly 7-1 numerical advantage in elephants. Antigonus' son Demetrius would take the position his father used to command, namely, that's the head of the heavy cavalry, and he would be instrumental to Antigonus' plans. He and Demetrius had spent an unusual amount of time the night before alone, planning by themselves and discussing tactics away from their officers. Now, this is a bit unusual because normally there'd be some kind of council or the officers be informed what's the plan, what's going on, you do what, but it's really left up to father and son. Now, we can remember that Demetrius and Antigonus had this unusual relationship in the Macedonian world, whereas father and son, they really trusted each other and could really rely on each other, and that was kind of considered abnormal. It was definitely not something that the other commanders could rely on. But anyway, regardless, the outcome was a plan by Demetrius to use the cover created by the marching elephants to swing his cavalry around and engage the enemy cavalry, hopefully blowing them off the field and allowing for the classic roll-up of the infantry afterward. Pretty good plan, very Macedonian, very typical. The cavalry would have to do their job, but it is the plan that Demetrius and Antigonus have agreed upon, and it seems like the most logical thing for them to do. We'll see what happens. The next day, when the armies deployed, both placed their infantry in the centre. They placed their cavalry on the wings and a line of elephants to screen the front. Seleucus would let his son, that's namely the 20-year-old Antiochus, be at the head of the cavalry, and he would have an important command for that wing of the army. Once the battle began, a wall of Seleucid elephants, plugged with accompanying light infantry, paced towards Antigonus' line. This was unlike any other battle in Hellenistic history. Never before had so many elephants been deployed at one time, and the once successful Antigone tactic of concentrating some elephants onto a single point, that is not going to work this time. Demetrius' movements were spotted by Seleucus' son Antiochus, who importantly informed the army of the concealed cavalry movements and sent out the nomadic missile cavalry and a portion of elephants to intercept Demetrius. In the smokescreen of the dust, Demetrius decided on a radical repositioning of his cavalry. He detached 5,000 or so of the right wing of the Antigonid army and swung as far out as possible, and as a result they outpaced the elephants and they outranged the missile fire of the nomads. Then, by circling back, Demetrius engaged Antiochus and pushed his cavalry further and further away from the main army. Now it seems here at this point Seleucus' son Antiochus is almost certainly going to be killed. So to respond to this, Seleucus folds his vast elephant line around the back of the main line of the enemy army, and he sends light troops out to aid Antiochus. The plan for the Antigonids seems to be going well. Demetrius has pushed back the enemy cavalry further and further, and hopefully the next phase would be to wheel around, swing back, and roll up the inferior line of enemy infantry. But a few things horrifically stop Antigonus' plan. The repositioned elephants guaranteed that any doubling back of heavy cavalry could not simply smash into the rear of the phalanxes as normal, and the oncoming elephants of Seleucus would have to be stopped or they would trample through Antigonus' army. The only saving grace of this repositioning was that Antigonus now had enough of his own elephants to at least dampen the unstoppable wall of beasts that are lumbering towards him. Meanwhile, Demetrius had pressed on, and on, and on, pursuing his enemy and routing most of them off the battlefield. And this is a pretty dire situation for Antiochus. He is in dire straits. Now Demetrius had extended far beyond the main army lines, and he's about to charge back and smash into his enemies. But here, we see the return of the most effective of battle tactics. It is the elephant of surprise. Surprise! So out of nowhere, somehow, some way, there was a stealth deployment of 400 elephants.
Stealth elephants.
Led by Seleucus, and they had formed an impenetrable wall of grey, and they fully enclosed Demetrius. There are no openings of flanks. He can't ride around. Demetrius is now hopelessly removed from the battle, and he can only hope that his father was winning. So, Cathal, I don't know how that's done. How do you sneak 400 elephants onto the battlefield, and how do you get them to surround the enemy?
I know early on you were explaining how the successor kingdoms, they kind of stagnated in terms of infantry and cavalry tactics, but they were innovating with elephants. I wasn't expecting stealth elephants. I wasn't expecting that as an innovation. I still don't really understand how that happened.
That they were just deployed secretly. But this is a complete envelopment of the enemy cavalry with elephants. Like, how do you sneak 400 elephants across the battlefield and encircle the enemy? It's just, like, well done, Seleucus. So back to the main line, Antigonus, who had remained in the centre, is observing his left wing in a state of brutal warfare from the elephant engagement, and he's witnessing his infantry get pushed further and further back by the enemy infantry. Antigonus, though, has kept faith. He's waiting for the return of the victorious Demetrius to rectify this position. After this, Antigonus would observe nomadic cavalry surrounding his army and beginning to pick off his helpless infantry with missile fire. But still, Antigonus is holding hope Demetrius will return. With his right wing completely detached, light troops flooded in and they pepper the flanks of the heavy infantry, melting them away. But still, Antigonus stays hopeful that his son was on the way. And I think it's worth quoting the original Plutarch on this one. Quote, "But when the old king Antigonus still kept his post, and when a strong body of the enemies drew up to charge him, and one of those about him cried out to him, 'Sir, they are coming upon you,' he only replied, 'What else should they do? But Demetrius will come to my rescue.' And in this hope he persisted to the last, looking out on every side for his son's approach, until he was borne down by a whole multitude of darts, and fell. His other followers and friends fled, and Thorax of Larissa remained alone by the body." End quote. So, Cathal, that's a pretty big one. That's the end of the great Antigonus I, Monophthalmus. He's slain on the battlefield, a battle determined by elephants. And to go through it, like, the elephants prevented an Antigonid frontal win. The elephants forced Demetrius to detach his right wing from the main line of the army. The elephants wrapped around the main line to protect a sudden countercharge by Demetrius. And then the elephants dominated on the other wing. And then finally, 400 of them were somehow stealthily deployed, preventing any hope of Demetrius returning to save the Antigonid army from utter destruction. Yeah, it's why we're covering this one. I think of all the battles we're covering, this one is the most elephant-focused and elephant-central and determined by elephants. So, Cathal, what does the History Machine think about this battle?
History Machine was very impressed by the Seleucid side on this one.
Oh, okay, really? Alright, wow.
It did not expect him to win the battle. It gave him a bit better than a 20% chance to win.
Oh, wow, okay, sorry, 20%.
Yeah. So, huge win over expectation from there. He dealt 80% more casualties than expected.
Yeah, that's really against the odds.
And took about the number of casualties suffered. So I think History Machine, after all the elephant battles, it kind of went like, listen, they're not the deciding factor. They don't impact things too much. But it didn't count on, one, what if you add even more elephants? And two, what if no one can see them until it's too late? It did not bank on those factors, and so Battle of Ipsus it considers a triumph for the Seleucid side.
Yeah, now I know for this battle I was expecting a fairly good result, because it's a lot of work to try and utilise everything in this way. Like, tactically speaking, it's really going against the grain, and it's going against the normal Macedonian style of warfare that's often very infantry and cavalry focused. This one is so elephant heavy, I was very curious how the History Machine was going to interpret it. Like, so Seleucus was able to pull this off in the end, so it's very, very impressive.
I think the History Machine, it usually... It favours maybe good tactics over good strategies, but I think also sometimes it just favours it when you win with a really unexpected composition that no one else used. And I think that's an example of this in effect.
Oh, so actually I'm going to give you two very interesting facts about this battle. The first is that Demetrius managed to escape this battle alive. So Demetrius was a king. He was elevated to the position of king in the same way that he had elevated his father to king. When we'd mentioned earlier in the episode that Demetrius loved two things. He loved wine and he loved women. That was his thing. So, but, you know, so most people have in their lives some kind of goal or target or objective, something that they're working towards. In the case of Demetrius, why does he even want to be a king? Like, what's the end goal? And the aim for Demetrius is to acquire enough power, wealth, and prestige to just live a life of food, alcohol, and women. That's it. That is what drives him. That's his modus operandi. So for the case of Demetrius, he has the Tony Montana drive. First you get the elephants, then you get the power, then you get the women, and also wine. So
no one ever explained to him that there are very poor people who pull this off quite well.
Yeah. So like part of me thinks the man would have been just as happy if he was a wino. Like, so it's maddening to think his entire goal to have a kingdom is so he can do that. And the irony of this is when he is captured, he's going to be kept as a prisoner by the Seleucids, but he's not going to be like a prisoner in a jail cell. He's going to just be let at banquets with wine and women. So he's let live this life of hedonism, which is all he ever wanted to do. The irony of the situation is, when he is captured and made a POW, he's going to live the rest of his life in complete debauchery, and an absolutely no surprise from his style of living. After 3 years, Demetrius will die of excessive consumption of food and alcohol at the age of only 55. So yeah, Demetrius survived this only to be put into one of those, ironic punishments.
It's very interesting seeing the ironic punishment thing actually implemented.
Yeah, you just get to live a life of, whatever you want to do. So
have all the booze that you want.
Yeah, you just get to live a life of, whatever you want to do. So, the second interesting note, one very special person fought in this battle. Now, he was in command of sections of the successful cavalry of Demetrius. This person would end up becoming a famous figure in his own right and would decide that elephants must become a feature of his army. Who would go on to become a thorn in Rome's side and bring elephants over to Italy. So this is the first known battle of Pyrrhus of Epirus. So yes, these 3 battles. So we did cover these 3 battles for the purposes of elephants, and for the Battle of Pharatachene, that's one where elephants are useful. They stopped the original battle plan from happening. Then for the Battle of Gabani, for that battle they weren't the deciding factor at all. And then for the Battle of Ipsus, the elephants are essential. They determined the outcome of the entire engagement. So we actually have an example where they're useful, they're useless, and they're essential, which I suppose sums up elephants as a whole. And all 3 of these battles help determine the highs and lows of using elephants in battle, and how they, elephants that is, as a beast of war, are almost never the deciding factor in a battle, until they are. That's almost the take home of elephants as a whole. They're so expensive.
Yeah. They're just the maximum wild card of any of these armies, and you have to have so much money to afford them that you probably, for the same cost, you could have just made a bigger conventional army that would also do the job.
Oh my god, you do. They're so uneconomical. They're just not, pound for pound, weight for weight, cost for cost. They're so uneconomical. It's madness.
Except for these freak occurrences.
Yeah, that's it. Elephants. You don't need them until you do. All right, so Cathal, we will wrap up this episode and we're going to do a top 4. So please, coming in here at number 4.
At number 4, we have Antigonus.
Oh, wow, okay, I wasn't expecting that.
It doesn't have his wins over expectation as terrible, but they're just kind of close to average. It's about minus 10%.
Oh, okay.
And I think the main factor as well, as we mentioned with those battles, but he had 8 battles in the database, 5 wins and a draw, which isn't bad, but the battles that he drew and lost, he had such bad casualties suffered in those ones. Yeah, he lost about 33% more troops than expected, and didn't really deal any more than expected over the course of his battles.
Now, it's funny because I know when we studied him last time, we ranked him quite low and we kind of attributed that to the idea that he was like a lesser Alexander. And I kind of thought that this episode might raise him a little bit, raise his profile and show that he was more competent as a commander, but it's not actually reflected by the History Machine's analysis of it. And when you read about Antigonus, there's usually an argument that, the rest of the successor kingdoms joined together to take him on and take him out because he was too strong of a threat. Now, that is correct. But what Antigonus has going for him is not that necessarily he's the best commander, but that he has the most resources.
Yeah.
The rest have to combine to take him out. Otherwise, he'll pick them off piece by piece.
Yeah.
Because he has the most stuff. Minus elephants, of course.
Yeah.
But he does. He's got the most money, he's got the most land, and at the moment he has the best claim, debatable, but at the moment he probably has the best claim to being the successor of Alexander. And that's not through any kind of birthright or anything like that. It's through military might. And that's where it's at, yeah.
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 The history machine takeaway is just kind of considering all the resources he had at his disposal, he should have done better than 5.5 wins out of 8 battles.
Oh yeah, and another point, we mentioned it earlier, but Seleucus was all about, please, somebody unite with me.
Yeah.
I will be your friend forever. And all Antigonus had to do in that situation is go, yeah, okay, you'll be my trusty ally. And we probably would have been able to take out everybody else. But then again, there's also the possibility that Antigonus doesn't want to have any rival king left. It's just only him. That's a possibility. Just going to be him and Demetrius. But yeah, but if he did that, if he just consolidated his gains, and if he formed a very strong alliance, he'd be in a much better position.
Yeah.
And that would have been it for the Antigonids. They would have ended up starting this long-lasting dynasty. So yeah, it's funny because I'm both surprised but not surprised at this result. So yeah, just for the benefit of listeners, when we updated the history machine to the new version with extra changes and bits and pieces, we saw a lot of movement in the rankings and a lot of reassessment of existing commanders. And that was based upon army compositions, a reanalysis, and that kind of a thing. For example, Hannibal went up a little bit, Caesar went up a little bit, Pompey went up a little bit. So there's some people who kind of improved and some people who went down. And I honestly thought there was, I thought, considering some other people had jumped up, there was going to be a reasonable reassessment of Antigonus and that he would probably rank a bit better, or that was definitely a possibility. But there were some people who went up a little bit and there were some people who went down a lot. And I thought from here that our good old buddy Antigonus, one-eyed, good old Anthony O'Sullivan, he was going to go up a little bit. But that's not the case. And for the reasons we've just listed there, we can see why he didn't. So, Cathal, coming in at number 3.
At number 3 we have Demetrius.
Okay, like father, like son.
I suppose because he was co-commander with his dad a lot of the time, his stats are very similar. It's slightly more favourable on the wins over expectation. It doesn't judge him quite as harshly. But similarly, the casualties suffered are pretty bad. Felt are a bit better. But it all kind of balances out. He comes across overall as very average in terms of results and maybe just having a bit more bloody, messy battles than you would like to have. Again, part of that could be that we are not having to, say, take this with a grain of salt quite as much. I think the accounts of the battle show that it was really messy and really complicated and really difficult. So,
yeah.
Maybe it's just that bit more honesty that we see how you should just expect a lot of casualties when you're dealing with ancient warfare.
I was just going to say I wasn't sure where it was going to place in this episode, but I do want to mention something quite interesting. I'll bring it up very quickly. If you read anything about Demetrius, most of it comes from one source, and that source is Plutarch, specifically Plutarch's Lives. And in Plutarch's Lives, he's making a direct comparison between the life of Demetrius and the life of Mark Antony. Mark Antony being a lieutenant of Caesar. And in a way, the comparison is that they were both the heir apparent. They both had a lot of potential. They both had a lot going for them. But importantly, they both suffered very heavily from vices. Because generally in Plutarch's Lives, he makes a lot of comparison between great men and going, ooh, I wonder what these two guys have in common, and do their lives overlap, and what comparisons can we make, and do they grow up in a similar environment, that kind of a thing, and are they driven by the same kind of things? So when Plutarch makes these comparisons, he's often comparing some very successful figures, and he's usually comparing their virtues, the positive aspects of these people. But for this case of Demetrius and Mark Antony, Plutarch is more looking at the idea of what went wrong. Let's make a comparison between two figures who had a very negative outcome. By all expectations, these two should have been roaring successes. And for that reason, Cathal, could we make, with the history machine, a comparison between Demetrius and Mark Antony?
So the history machine actually has them really similar. His casualties suffered and his casualties dealt are almost exactly to expectation. Mark Antony is ranked a bit higher, but his wins over expectation, it's very close to average as well. It's not that far above 0, whereas Demetrius is not that far below 0. The main difference is Mark Antony's battles are cleaner.
Oh, okay, that's very interesting.
That is the key difference, but you could just rank them as having very, very similar stats otherwise.
Okay, that's interesting. That's very good. All right, that's really interesting. So they're almost exactly the same in the eyes of the history machines. That's way... Yeah, because vices and personality-wise, they're meant to be incredibly similar. Because if we follow Plutarch, he's kind of making this comparison of, look, they're both ladies' men and they both like alcohol and they both have these vices and types of personality made these people what they were. And it's kind of fun to see that the history machine has them roughly equal. Because it'd be nice to imagine that the same kind of personality produces the same kind of a commander.
Though just arguably that Demetrius was a bit sloppier about it.
Okay, that's fair enough, though. Okay, so we'll move on. Coming in at number 2.
Number 2, we have Eumenes, who is kind of the mirror image to Demetrius and Antigonus, where in this case he is slightly above average in wins over expectation, but he does have a losing record. He has 4 battles, 1 win, 1 draw. However, the main thing in his favour is that the casualties suffered are below expectation by about 15%, and he deals out about 33% more casualties than expected. So he was able to do more with less, whereas Antigonus and Demetrius were kind of doing less with more. And you did see in his style, like, Eumenes, he really went after, like, with the resources he had, he tried and poach the real elite troops, and maybe his army composition wasn't great across the board. He had to do a lot of, I suppose, just conscription of kind of local and train them as best he could. But then where he was able to, he did try and just get, the biggest talents he could, I suppose, into his army.
And that is very true, because he employed the best of the best. I mean, when I think about it, he spent so much money on the silver shields. And in the end, well, number 1, they hand him over. So that money all went to waste. That's money right down the drain.
Yeah.
But even in the first battle, the silver shields do tremendously well, but they're not the deciding factor. Because it's funny, because for those guys, the silver shields, in the time of Alexander, they never lost a battle. Because under Alexander, they were like win, 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 win.
Yeah.
And it's only after that, when they're courted by the various armies to kind of say, please join us, here's a lot of money to do so, that they can say they have a loss in the record. But even then, during the battles that they're in, they perform beyond expectation. They deliver what they're meant to deliver. They have won their engagement. It's everybody else that's failed. Like,
it seemed like he was just bad at pushing his initiative and everything, and when he had the advantage, he didn't press on enough, and then when he tried to press on enough, it was after the rest of his army was like, no, pay me. This is not the time that we want to do this.
Exactly, yeah. Oh yeah, and the other thing to mention was that he was the outsider. He was the foreigner in the eyes of the other officers. Foreigner, he was Greek and they were Macedonians, not a million miles away. But there's your xenophobia. But little differences.
But again, history machine can't factor in that charisma, and that was kind of his undoing. He just really lacked loyalty.
The officers in his army were very much the opinion, we don't want to follow this guy. He's an admin fellow. That's it. He's nothing important. Like, he was never good buddies with Alexander. Well, anyway, I suppose it shows that he must have picked up stuff along the way, because he's outdoing, his enemies. And obviously he was giving old One Eye a very hard time, and he only lost because they ended up being handed over by his own army. So yeah, I suppose that's why he's coming in at number 2.
And also, you can pay people as much as you want, but they still won't be your real friends.
Oh yeah, and that's the important thing of the keep your friends close and your enemies closer, and why it's not a good strategy. Because I don't think there's a good example of that strategy ever working, but it's a very good example of it not working.
It sounds good though.
Oh, it's a lovely phrase. But then when you put it into practice, it doesn't work at all. You never want to be put into the position where I'm going to put my safety and my life in the hands of people who are my enemies. Are you out of your mind? Don't you ever do that. And don't you ever put an unknown in charge of your left wing. They are useless. Yeah.
And also, you can pay people as much as you want, but they still won't be your real friends.
That's very true. I was going to say he was lucky he came in there at number 2, but at number 1.
Number 1 is Seleucus I.
That is nice.
He has 8 battles and 7 wins. We only got into one of them, but that one was one that definitely upped his stats dramatically. History Machine was seriously impressed by that battle. On average, though, wins over expectation were like 40% higher than average. Suffered about average casualties, but dealt out about 35% more casualties than expected. And also one of the few generals that consistently captured or killed enemy commanders.
Oh, that's very good.
Which is not something that comes up often in the History Machine, but he is one who pulled it off multiple times. So
that's kind of what Alexander was trying to do for a lot of his battles.
Yeah, yeah. He takes after Alexander a lot in that way, yeah.
So it's a very Macedonian style of warfare. Now, Seleucus is a fascinating individual. You know, we mentioned it a little bit earlier. He goes from junior officer and works his way all the way to the head of a dynasty. You know, during the time of Alexander, he wasn't really anybody, but it's during the successor wars that he really makes the name for himself. And he rises all the way to the top, forming arguably the most successful successor kingdom.
Maybe kind of telling that he kind of was a little bit more self-made than the others who were just kind of
Definitely
got in on reputation or relationships. He actually had to work his way up from a junior position.
It's very true. Oh, you know, sorry. The other ones do have years of experience of being veterans and being pals with Alexander and, you know, steel sharpening steel, and they're improving off each other. But you can't say Seleucus is not experienced. And you can't say that he's a Nepo baby because he worked his way to the top. But he's a fascinating character, Seleucus. Because when we did the vote that ended up being the Pompey episode, Seleucus was in there as an option. And I think he came second. It is kind of good we can kind of touch on him a little bit here on this bonus episode. Just to give you a little bit of a taste of what he is. Well, he's a fascinating guy. Ended up trading land for 500 elephants. And that paid off in the end.
I'm already regretting not demanding my Christmas bonus in the form of elephants this year.
Oh, brilliant.
I'll have to wait till next year.
Where's my elephant, Cathal? So we might do a tiny little bit more about elephants just before we finish up, because this is a bonus episode about elephants. And I think the kind of summary of them is, they're very intelligent animals, they're expensive, they require tremendous training, tremendous upkeep, and they require a personal handler. But just damn it, they're so good.
There's a chance they can be so impressive, though. The phrase white elephant now makes a ton of sense. It really does. Just the thing that, like, you just can't let go of the idea that this is costing you so much more than it gives back to you, because there's just a slim chance it'll be amazing.
And it's a beautiful slim chance. You kind of go, oh, if only it pays off. Because, you know, as we said earlier, they're almost never the deciding factor in a battle until they are.
Yeah.
Oh, and lastly, I know we mentioned in some of the bonus episodes the representation of the chessboard.
Yeah.
So the pawns are the infantry, the knight is the light cavalry, the rook is the chariot, and I believe the bishop is the elephant. And it's quite a good comparison, because like the elephant, if you open the ranks, they'll walk right through.
Yeah.
They'll spin around the board, never able to get their hands on anything. And at times, they're considered extremely valuable, and other times considered not valuable at all, depending on the situation at hand. And like elephants in the battlefield, they're not useful until they are. I was just mentioning that to complete the old chess set. So that's it. That's elephants. They're a fascinating animal, extremely intelligent, incredibly expensive. And I think these are 3 good battles to show how elephants can be useful, useless, or essential. So yes, thanks very much. We're going to wrap up. Thanks very much for your time. I've been Niall.
And I've been Cathal.
And we'll see you again.